Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're diving into something that might sound completely ridiculous at first, but trust me, it's going to blow your mind. Medieval junk food. Yes, you heard that right. Long before McDonald's, before Doritos, before your local gas station started selling questionable hot dogs that have been rotating under heat lamps for who knows how long, people in the Middle Ages had their own version of fast food. And let me tell you, some of it was absolutely wild. Now, before you roll your eyes and think this is just another boring history lesson, stick with me here. Because what I discovered while researching this topic completely changed how I think about food, society, and human nature itself. We like to imagine that our modern obsession with quick, convenient, often unhealthy snacks is somehow unique to our time. That fast food is this recent invention that's corrupting our pure, natural eating habits. But that's complete nonsense. The truth is, humans have been craving greasy, sweet, salty, portable treats for over 1,000 years. The only difference is how we make them and where we get them. So grab something to snack on, maybe dim the lights a bit, and let's take a journey back to a time when your local fast food joint was a smoke-filled cookshop by the Thames. And your favorite guilty pleasure might have been a meat pie filled with, well, let's just say the health inspectors weren't exactly keeping tabs on things back then. Picture this. It's a crisp autumn morning in London, sometime around the year 1250. The sun is barely peeking through the thick grey clouds that seem permanently stationed above the city, and the air is filled with a mixture of wood smoke, horse manure, and something else. Something that makes your stomach growl, despite the questionable sanitation standards of the era. That something is the smell of food, hot food, being prepared and sold right there on the street. You're walking along the muddy, narrow roads that wind their way toward the Thames, dodging carts pulled by oxen, stepping carefully around puddles that you really don't want to think too hard about when you hear it. The calls of vendors, the sizzle of fat in hot pans, the general chaos of what can only be described as medieval fast food in full swing. Hot pies! Fresh from the oven! Get your hot pies here! Fritters, sweet apple fritters, still warm. Bread bowls. Fill them with whatever you fancy. This isn't some quaint farmer's market with organic kale and artisanal cheese. This is survival capitalism at its most basic level. People packed into tiny rooms with no kitchens, no money for cooking fuel, no space to store ingredients, all desperately needing something hot and filling to get them through another day of backbreaking labor. And where there's desperate hunger, there's always someone ready to make a profit. The cookshops along the Thames weren't just businesses, they were lifelines. Open 24 hours a day, serving everyone from dock workers finishing the night shift to merchants starting their day before dawn. These places were loud, chaotic, and absolutely essential to keeping the city running. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of a 7-Eleven, but with way more fire hazards and significantly fewer health regulations. Let me introduce you to someone. Her name is Margot, and she's been running a cookshop near London Bridge for the past 15 years. She's up every morning at 4, lighting the fires, preparing the dough, getting ready for the endless stream of hungry customers who will start arriving before the sun comes up. Margot knows her business inside and out. She knows which dock workers prefer their meat pies extra greasy, which merchants will pay extra for the good stuff, and which customers she needs to keep an eye on because they'll try to walk off without paying. But Margot also knows something else. She knows that survival in this business means walking a very fine line between profit and poison, because in a world without refrigeration, without food safety inspectors, without any real way to tell if meat has gone bad until it's way too late, every meal is a gamble. And sometimes, when business is slow and money is tight, that gamble involves using ingredients that probably should have been thrown out days ago. "What'll it be today, love?" Margot calls out to a young man who's just stumbled up to her stall, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. He's clearly been working all night, probably loading cargo down at the docks, and he's got that hollow-eyed look of someone who needs food and needs it now. "Meat pie," he mumbles, digging around in his pocket for coins. "And make it a big one. Got a long day ahead. Margot reaches into one of her clay ovens and pulls out a steaming pie, the crust golden brown and glistening with fat. It's about the size of a modern hamburger, maybe a bit larger, and it's wrapped in a thick pastry shell that's been baked until it's hard enough to use as a bowl. This isn't delicate French pastry we're talking about. This is functional food, designed to be portable, filling, and sturdy enough to survive being carried around in a leather pouch for hours. The young dock worker takes his pie and bites into it immediately, not bothering to wait for it to cool down. Steam escapes from the crust, carrying with it the smell of meat, onions, and spices. His face lights up with relief and satisfaction. This is exactly what he needed. Hot, greasy, salty, and substantial enough to keep him going until his next break. But here's where things get interesting. What's actually in that pie? Well, if you're lucky, it's pork or beef or chicken, seasoned with whatever spices Margot could afford that week. If you're less lucky, it might be rabbit, or goose, or something else that was available and cheap. And if you're really unlucky, well, let's just say that the meat might have been sitting around a bit longer than it should have. This is the dark side of medieval fast food, and it's something that every customer understood, even if they didn't like to think about it. In a world where fresh meat was expensive and refrigeration was impossible, cookshop owners had to make tough choices. Do you throw away yesterday's leftover meat and lose money? Or do you dice it up, season it heavily, and hope the cooking process kills anything dangerous? The answer, more often than not, was the latter. Medieval cookshops were notorious for their creative approach to food safety. Spoiled meat could be disguised with extra spices. Day-old pies could be reheated and sold as fresh. And if a customer complained about the taste, well, that was just the risk you took when you ate fast food. But despite the risks, people kept coming back. They had to. For most medieval city dwellers, cookshops weren't a convenience, they were a necessity. The alternative was going hungry, and that wasn't really an option when you needed energy for 12 hours of manual labour. As our dock worker finishes his pie and heads off to work, another customer approaches Margot's stall. This one is different. Better dressed, cleaner, clearly someone with a bit more money to spend. This is Thomas, a merchant who deals in wool and cloth, and he's looking for something a bit more upscale than the basic meat pie. "Good morning, Margot," Thomas says with a polite nod. "What have you got that's special today?" Margot grins. This is the kind of customer she likes, someone who can afford the good stuff and isn't afraid to pay for it. "Well now, Thomas, I've got something you might fancy. Fresh chicken, wrapped in pastry with real ginger and a touch of honey. Cost you a bit more, but it's worth every penny." She reaches into a different section of her oven and pulls out a pie that's noticeably different from the one she sold to the dock worker. The crust is more delicate, the filling more carefully prepared, the overall presentation more refined. This is medieval fast food's version of going upscale, and it shows that even in the Middle Ages, there were different tiers of convenience food, depending on what you could afford. Thomas examines the pie carefully before taking a bite. His reaction is immediate and positive. The meat is tender, the spices are balanced, and there's a sweetness from the honey that makes the whole thing feel like a treat rather than just sustenance. This is what medieval junk food could be at its best, when quality ingredients met skilled preparation and customers who were willing to pay for the difference. But even Thomas's upscale pie represents something that would seem strange to modern fast food consumers. The crust isn't just packaging, it's part of the meal. Thick, chewy, and substantial, it's designed to be eaten along with the filling. In fact, for many medieval people, the crust was often the most filling part of the pie, providing the bulk of the calories and carbohydrates they needed to get through the day. This is where we start to see one of the fundamental differences between medieval and modern junk food. Today, we often think of packaging as something to be thrown away, but in the Middle Ages, everything edible was valuable. Waste wasn't just environmentally irresponsible, it was economically impossible for most people. So the thick pie crusts, the bread bowls, even the wooden trenchers that served as plates Everything was designed to be consumed. Speaking of bread bowls, let's talk about one of the most ingenious inventions of medieval fast food culture. As Thomas finishes his pie and continues on his way, we notice another customer at a different stall, one that specializes in what we might call the medieval equivalent of a bread bowl from Panera. This customer is a young woman named Eleanor, and she's got a different kind of hunger than the dock worker or the merchant. She's looking for something that will serve as both container and meal, something portable that she can take with her as she goes about her daily business in the city. The vendor at this stall, a burly man named Edmund, specializes in trenchers. These are thick slices of bread, usually made from coarse whole wheat, that have been cut into squares about 4 inches wide and half an inch thick. But Edmund has taken the concept one step further. He's learned to shape bread dough into actual bowl forms, creating edible containers that can hold stews, sauces, or other wet foods without falling apart. "What can I fill for you today?" Edmund asks Eleanor, gesturing to his selection of bread bowls. "Something warming," Eleanor replies. "It's going to be a cold day, and I've got a lot of walking to do." Edmund ladles a thick, hearty stew into one of his bread bowls. The stew is made from whatever vegetables were available that morning, probably some onions, leeks, maybe a few carrots if he was lucky, all simmered together with some meat scraps and seasoned with herbs. It's not fancy, but it's hot, filling, and nutritious. Eleanor takes the bread bowl carefully, holding it with both hands to avoid spilling. As she walks away, she'll eat the stew first, using pieces of the bread bowl to scoop it up, and then finish by eating the bowl itself, now thoroughly soaked with the flavors of the stew. It's efficient, practical, and surprisingly satisfying. This is medieval sustainability at its finest. No plastic containers, no disposable packaging, no waste at all. Everything serves a purpose, and everything gets consumed. It's a system that modern environmentalists would probably admire, even if they might have concerns about the food safety standards. But let's not get too romantic about medieval food culture. For every success story like Eleanor's satisfying bread bowl meal, there were plenty of disasters. Food poisoning was common, quality was inconsistent, and the line between aged to perfection and dangerously spoiled was often crossed with alarming frequency. The authorities knew this, of course. By the 13th century, cities like London were already trying to regulate their fast food industries. Price controls were implemented to prevent cookshop owners from gouging desperate customers. Quality standards were established, though enforcing them was another matter entirely. Laws were passed requiring bakers to charge no more than a penny for cooking customer-supplied meat, showing that even medieval governments understood the importance of keeping fast food affordable. These regulations tell us something important about medieval society. Fast food wasn't seen as a luxury or an indulgence. It was recognized as an essential service that needed to be regulated like any other public utility. The fact that governments felt the need to control prices and quality shows just how important these cookshops had become to urban life. But regulation could only do so much. The fundamental challenges of medieval food production, lack of refrigeration, inconsistent supply chains, limited preservation methods, meant that eating fast food was always going to involve some level of risk. Customers understood this, and they developed their own strategies for minimizing danger. Experienced fast food consumers learned to read the signs. They knew which cookshops had the best reputations, which vendors could be trusted with their health, and which times of day were safest for buying prepared food. They learned to look for visual cues that indicated freshness, to smell for signs of spoilage, and to trust their instincts when something seemed off. This created a kind of informal quality control system based on reputation and word of mouth. Cookshop owners who consistently served bad food would quickly find themselves without customers, while those who maintained higher standards could charge premium prices and build loyal followings. As the morning progresses and our medieval London street scene continues to unfold, we start to see the full ecosystem of fast food culture in action. It's not just about individual vendors selling to individual customers. It's about a complex network of suppliers, preparers, and consumers, all working together to solve the fundamental problem of feeding a large urban population quickly and efficiently. The bakers who provide the bread for trenchers and pie crusts. The farmers who supply the meat, vegetables, and grains. The spice merchants who import exotic seasonings from far-off lands. The fuel suppliers who provide the wood and charcoal needed to keep the cooking fires burning. The customers who create demand for different types of food at different times of day. All of these people are part of the medieval fast food industry, and their interactions create the bustling, chaotic, but ultimately functional system we're witnessing. And it's not just about survival either. Even in the Middle Ages, people understood that food could be about pleasure as well as sustenance. The addition of spices to meat pies, the development of sweet treats like fritters and gingerbread, the creation of different quality levels for different types of customers. All of this shows that medieval people were just as interested in enjoying their food as we are today. The human desire for variety, for indulgence, for treats that go beyond basic nutrition, these aren't modern inventions. They're fundamental aspects of human nature that have been with us for thousands of years. The only thing that's changed is our methods and our scale. As we continue our journey through the world of medieval junk food, we'll discover that this pattern, this tension between necessity and pleasure, between survival and indulgence, between safety and risk, plays out again and again across different cultures, different time periods, and different types of food. The details change, but the underlying human motivations remain remarkably consistent. The sweet tooth, it turns out, is nothing new. As the afternoon sun climbs higher over our bustling London street, casting long shadows between the crowded stalls, we encounter something that would make any modern candy lover's heart skip a beat. The smell hits you first, warm and golden, like liquid sunshine mixed with spice and fire. Fritters, hot apple fritters, sweet as honey, crisp as autumn leaves. The voice belongs to Agnes, a woman in her 40s with flour-dusted hands, and a smile that's seen enough satisfied customers to know her business inside and out. She's standing behind a wooden table that's seen better days, its surface scarred by years of hot oil and sharp knives. But her setup is nothing short of impressive for its time. Agnes has mastered what we might recognize today as the medieval ancestor of the donut. But calling these fritters donuts would be like calling a wolf a house dog. Sure, they're related, but the medieval version is wilder, more unpredictable, and significantly more dangerous to make. The process starts with apples. Not the perfect waxed spheres you'd find in a modern supermarket, but small, tart, irregularly shaped fruits that grew wild in the orchards outside the city. These apples are chopped roughly, sometimes with the skin still on, sometimes not, depending on how much time Agnes has and how picky her customers are feeling that day. The batter is where things get interesting. Flour, obviously, but flour that's been ground from grain that might have contained more than just wheat. Medieval flour was often a mixture of whatever grains were available: barley, oats, sometimes even beans ground up to stretch the supply. Add to that some eggs when they're available and affordable, and liquid that might be water if you're feeling optimistic about the local water supply, or more likely ale, because fermented beverages were generally safer than whatever was coming out of the wells. Agnes mixes this batter with a wooden spoon that's probably older than she is, working it until it reaches the right consistency. Too thick, and the fritters will be heavy and greasy. Too thin, and they'll fall apart in the oil. Getting it right takes experience, and Agnes has been making fritters for over 20 years. The oil is where the real magic and danger come in. Agnes uses rendered pig fat, heated in a large iron pot over an open fire. There's no temperature control, no thermometer, just experience and intuition to tell her when the fat is hot enough to fry, without being so hot that it catches fire and burns down half the street. This has happened before, by the way. Medieval cities were constantly dealing with fires started by cooking accidents, and the combination of open flames, hot oil, and wooden buildings made every meal a potential disaster. But when Agnes gets it right, and she usually does, the result is magical. She dips pieces of apple into the batter, making sure they're completely coated, then carefully lowers them into the bubbling fat. The sizzling is immediate and violent, sending up clouds of steam that carry the scent of cooking fruit and browning batter throughout the surrounding area. Within minutes, the fritters are golden brown and crispy on the outside, tender and sweet on the inside. Agnes lifts them out with a long wooden spoon, letting the excess oil drip back into the pot, then arranges them on a wooden board to cool just enough that they won't burn your tongue completely off. The final touch is honey. Real honey. Thick and golden, harvested from beehives that someone risked their life to raid. Sugar is still a luxury that most people can't afford, imported from distant lands at prices that would make your modern wallet weep. But honey is local, natural, and when drizzled over a hot apple fritter, it creates a combination of flavors and textures that would make a modern pastry chef jealous. A young apprentice blacksmith named Robert approaches Agnes's stall, drawn by the smell and the promise of something sweet to break up his day of hammering hot metal. He's got soot under his fingernails and burn marks on his arms, but he's also got a few coins in his pocket and a craving for something that doesn't taste like iron and charcoal. "How much for two?" Robert asks, eyeing the fritters with obvious hunger. "2 pence for a pair," Agnes replies, "and worth every bit of it. Fresh from the oil, still warm, and I'll give you extra honey if you promise to tell your friends where you got them." Robert hands over his coins without hesitation. These fritters represent more than just food to him. They're a brief escape from the heat and noise and endless repetition of his trade. They're a moment of sweetness in a life that's often harsh and unforgiving. They're proof that even in a world without modern conveniences, humans can create something beautiful and delicious from simple ingredients and a bit of skill. He bites into the first fritter immediately, not bothering to wait for it to cool. The exterior cracks under his teeth, releasing a burst of steam and the concentrated flavor of cooked apple. The honey runs down his chin, but he doesn't care. This is pure pleasure. The kind of simple joy that transcends centuries and connects us to our ancestors in the most basic way possible. But Robert's fritters are just the beginning of medieval sweet treats. As he walks away, savouring his purchase, we notice another vendor setting up shop just down the street. This one is different, more mysterious, with an air of exotic sophistication that immediately sets him apart from the other food sellers. This is Hassan, a merchant who's travelled from the Middle East along trade routes that stretch across continents. His stall is small but carefully arranged, displaying confections that most of the local customers have never seen before. These aren't the rough, practical foods of English cookshops. These are delicacies, treats that speak of distant lands and sophisticated palates. Hassan's specialty is something he calls halva, though the local customers struggle with the pronunciation and usually just point at what they want. It's made from sesame seeds that have been ground into a paste, mixed with honey and sugar when he can get it, then shaped into dense, sweet blocks that can be cut into portions. The process of making halva is both art and science. The sesame seeds must be roasted to exactly the right degree, enough to bring out their nutty flavour, but not so much that they become bitter. They're then ground in a stone mill until they form a smooth paste called tahini. This paste is mixed with honey that's been heated and stirred until it reaches the perfect consistency, creating a mixture that's dense, sweet, and incredibly rich. But Hassan doesn't just make plain halva. He's learned to flavour it with rosewater, giving it a floral aroma that's both exotic and intoxicating. He adds pistachios when he can afford them, creating green speckled confections that look like jewels. Sometimes he incorporates dried fruits, figs, or dates chopped fine and folded into the mixture, adding bursts of concentrated sweetness that complement the nutty base. The result is something that would be completely familiar to anyone who's visited a Middle Eastern sweet shop today. But to medieval Londoners, it's like tasting food from another planet. The flavors are intense, complex, layered in ways that their local cuisine rarely achieves. This is food as luxury, as experience, as a window into cultures they'll never see but can taste, if only for a moment. A well-dressed merchant's wife named Margaret approaches Hassan's stall, drawn by curiosity and the kind of adventurous spirit that comes with having enough money to risk trying something unusual. She's heard rumors about this foreign merchant and his strange sweets, and today she's decided to see what all the fuss is about. "What is this?" she asks, pointing to a tray of halva studded with pistachios. Hassan smiles, recognizing the universal language of curiosity about food. "This is halva, my lady, made from sesame seeds and honey, flavored with rosewater from Damascus. Very sweet, very rich. In my country, we serve this at weddings and celebrations." Margaret looks skeptical but intrigued. The idea of food flavored with flowers is strange to her, but the merchant's obvious pride in his product is convincing. "How much?" "For you, my lady, because you are my first English customer today. Only 4 pence for a piece this size." Hassan cuts a generous portion of the halva, wrapping it carefully in a piece of clean cloth. Margaret pays and takes a small, cautious bite. Her reaction is immediate and dramatic. Her eyes widen, then close in pleasure as the complex flavors hit her palate. The nuttiness of the sesame, the sweetness of the honey, the delicate floral notes of the rosewater, all combine to create something completely unlike anything she's ever tasted. "This is extraordinary," she says, and Hassan beams with pride. He knows he's just created a customer for life, and probably several more when Margaret goes home and tells her friends about this amazing discovery. But Hassan's halva represents something more than just a successful business transaction. It's evidence of the medieval world's surprising interconnectedness, the way trade routes and cultural exchange could bring the flavors of one continent to the streets of another. Long before globalization, before international food chains, before the internet made it possible to order exotic ingredients from anywhere in the world, merchants like Hassan were creating the first international fast food experiences. The spices in his halva, the techniques he uses to make it, even the decorative way he presents his wares, all of this represents knowledge and traditions that have traveled thousands of miles to end up on a London street corner. It's a reminder that the medieval world was far more cosmopolitan and connected than we often imagine. As Margaret walks away, savouring her halva and already planning to return for more, we notice that Hassan's success is attracting attention from other vendors. Food culture, it turns out, is highly competitive, and the arrival of exotic new treats tends to inspire local innovation. Just across the street, a baker named William has been watching Hassan's customers with growing interest. William specializes in what we might recognize as early forms of pastries, sweetbreads, and cakes that represent the more sophisticated end of medieval baking. But seeing the enthusiasm for Hassan's foreign sweets has given him an idea. William has been experimenting with something he calls gingerbread, though it bears only a passing resemblance to what we'd recognize by that name today. His version starts with honey, lots of it, heated until it becomes almost caramelized. To this he adds breadcrumbs, not flour, creating a dense, chewy base that can support strong flavors. The spices are where William really shows his ambition. Ginger, obviously, but also cloves, cinnamon, and even a tiny amount of black pepper. These spices are expensive, imported from Asia at enormous cost, and using them in sweets is both a luxury and a risk. But William has discovered that the combination of sweet honey and sharp spices creates something irresistible, a treat that's both comforting and exciting. The process of making gingerbread is labor-intensive and requires careful timing. The honey must be heated to exactly the right temperature, hot enough to dissolve the breadcrumbs, but not so hot that it burns and turns bitter. The spices must be ground fresh and added at precisely the right moment to preserve their potency. The mixture must be stirred constantly to prevent scorching, then shaped and cooled until it reaches the proper consistency. What emerges from this process is something dense, dark, and intensely flavored. It's sweet, but not cloying. Spicy, but not overwhelming. Chewy, but not tough. It's the kind of confection that reveals new flavors with each bite, that satisfies in a way that simpler sweets can't match. William has been making gingerbread for special occasions, religious festivals, wealthy customers' private celebrations. But watching Hassan's success with exotic flavors has inspired him to try selling it as street food, to see if ordinary people might be willing to pay for something a bit more luxurious than the usual fare. He cuts his gingerbread into small squares and arranges them on a wooden tray, then calls out to the passing crowd, "Gingerbread! Sweet gingerbread with spices from the East! Taste the flavors of distant lands." The response is immediate and enthusiastic. People who might never be able to afford whole exotic spices are eager to taste them in William's confections. A group of young clerks from a nearby monastery pool their money to buy a piece to share. A mother buys a small portion for her children, treating them to something special on what's otherwise an ordinary day. One customer, a middle-aged wool merchant named Geoffrey, takes a bite and immediately starts asking questions. What's in this? How do you make it? Where do you get those spices? William is happy to explain, partly out of pride in his craft, and partly because he recognizes a potential wholesale customer when he sees one. Geoffrey, it turns out, has connections with other merchants, people who might be interested in buying gingerbread in larger quantities for their own customers or special events. This is how food trends spread in the medieval world. Not through advertising or marketing campaigns, but through word of mouth, through the simple human tendency to share good experiences with others. One successful vendor inspires another, one satisfied customer tells their friends, and gradually new flavors and techniques spread through the community. But medieval sweet treats weren't just about exotic spices and expensive ingredients. Some of the most beloved confections were made from humble, local materials, transformed through skill and creativity into something special. Take waffles, for instance, or rather what medieval people called arblis, thin wafers cooked between heated iron plates that created decorative patterns on the surface. These were the ancestors of modern waffles, but they were typically much thinner and more delicate, often flavoured with herbs or mild spices. The waffle iron itself was a marvel of medieval technology, two hinged metal plates with raised patterns that would imprint onto the batter as it cooked. These irons were expensive tools, often passed down through families of professional waffle makers, and using them required considerable skill. The batter for oublis was simple: flour, water, eggs when available, and sometimes a touch of honey for sweetness. But the technique of cooking them was anything but simple. The iron had to be heated to exactly the right temperature over a fire, not hot enough to burn the batter, but hot enough to cook it quickly and evenly. The batter had to be poured at just the right moment and in just the right amount. Too much and it would overflow, creating a mess. Too little and the waffle would be too thin and break when handled. A skilled waffle maker could turn out dozens of these delicate treats in an hour, each one perfectly cooked and beautifully patterned. They were often sold at religious festivals and fairs, where their decorative appearance and sweet flavour made them popular treats for special occasions. But here's where medieval waffle culture gets really interesting. Not all waffles were sweet. Some were made with cheese, creating savoury treats that were more like meal substitutes than desserts. And some, particularly in certain regions, were made with ingredients that would seem bizarre to modern palates. There are records of fish waffles, made with ground fish mixed into the batter, creating protein-rich snacks that were both nutritious and portable. There are mentions of waffles made with unusual combinations of sweet and savoury ingredients, reflecting medieval taste preferences that were quite different from our own. The point is that medieval people were constantly experimenting with food, trying new combinations, adapting recipes to local ingredients and preferences. The idea that medieval cuisine was boring or limited is completely wrong. Within the constraints of available ingredients and technology, medieval cooks were remarkably creative and adventurous. As our London street scene continues to evolve throughout the day, we start to see how all of these different food vendors and customers interact to create a complex ecosystem of medieval fast food culture. It's not just about individual transactions between buyers and sellers. It's about community, about shared experiences, about the way food brings people together across social and economic boundaries. The dock worker who bought a meat pie for breakfast might return in the afternoon for one of Agnes's apple fritters. The merchant's wife who discovered Hassan's halva might recommend William's gingerbread to her friends. The apprentice blacksmith might save up his coins to try something from every vendor on the street, creating his own personal tour of medieval junk food. And it's not just about the customers either. The vendors themselves form a community, sharing information about suppliers, warning each other about health inspectors or tax collectors, sometimes even collaborating on special events or seasonal promotions. During religious festivals, for instance, multiple vendors might coordinate their offerings to create themed food experiences. During Lent, when meat was forbidden, pastry makers might focus on sweet treats, while bread vendors offered fish-filled options. During harvest time, apple fritters and other fruit-based treats would become more common and affordable. This seasonal variation in available foods created a rhythm to medieval junk food culture that we've largely lost in our modern world of year-round availability. Medieval people looked forward to certain treats at certain times of year, anticipating the return of favourite flavours as eagerly as we might anticipate a new menu item at our favourite restaurant. The social dynamics around food were also more complex than they might initially appear. While cookshops and street vendors served primarily working-class customers who couldn't afford to cook at home, they also attracted people from higher social classes who were looking for convenience, novelty, or simply a bit of adventure. A noble lady might send a servant to buy meat pies for the household staff, but she might also slip out herself to try Hassan's exotic sweets or William's gingerbread. Food has always been one of the few areas where social boundaries become a bit more flexible, where curiosity and appetite can overcome class distinctions, at least temporarily. This democratizing effect of food is something we see throughout history, and medieval street food culture was no exception. While the wealthy could afford better ingredients and more elaborate preparations, the basic human pleasures of eating something sweet, salty, or satisfying were available to almost everyone, even if only occasionally. The technology of medieval food preparation also created interesting constraints and opportunities that shaped the development of different types of snacks and treats. Without refrigeration, for instance, many foods had to be designed to be consumed immediately or to have natural preservation properties. Honey-based sweets like gingerbread or halva could last for days or even weeks without spoiling, making them ideal for travelers or for vendors who couldn't sell their entire stock in a single day. Fried foods like fritters or meat pies were best consumed hot and fresh, but the frying process itself provided some protection against spoilage. Salt-preserved foods, pickled vegetables, and dried meats created entirely different categories of portable snacks that could sustain people on long journeys or provide nutrition during lean times. These weren't necessarily junk food in the modern sense, but they served similar functions as convenient, flavorful alternatives to formal meals. The spice trade, which brought exotic flavors from Asia and the Middle East to European markets, created opportunities for food vendors to differentiate their products and charge premium prices. A meat pie seasoned with black pepper or cinnamon was fundamentally different from one made with only local herbs, both in terms of flavor and social status. This connection between spices and luxury is something we've largely lost in the modern world, where most seasonings are readily available and affordable. But in medieval times, the ability to offer foods flavored with imported spices was a significant competitive advantage. and customers were willing to pay substantially more for the experience. The religious calendar also played a major role in shaping medieval food culture, creating periods of restriction and indulgence that affected both what people could eat and how much they were willing to spend on special treats. During fasting periods, sweet foods that didn't contain animal products became more popular and commanded higher prices. During feast days and religious festivals, people were more willing to splurge on expensive or exotic foods, creating seasonal opportunities for vendors to introduce new products or charge premium prices for familiar ones. The church's influence on daily life meant that food culture was never purely secular, but always embedded in larger spiritual and social contexts. As evening approaches and our medieval London street begins to quiet down, we can see the full scope of what we've been witnessing. This isn't just a collection of individual food vendors trying to make a living. It's a complex social and economic system that serves multiple functions simultaneously. It feeds people who can't cook for themselves. It provides employment for entrepreneurs and workers. It creates opportunities for cultural exchange and innovation. It offers moments of pleasure and indulgence in lives that are often harsh and difficult. It connects local communities to global trade networks. It adapts to seasonal changes and religious requirements. It serves as a testing ground for new flavors and techniques. In short, medieval fast food culture was doing everything that modern fast food culture does, just with different tools, different ingredients, and different social contexts. The human needs and desires that drive people to seek convenient, flavorful, affordable food haven't changed at all. Only the methods of satisfying those needs have evolved. But as the shadows grow longer and the cooking fires begin to burn lower, we start to encounter something that might surprise you. Not all medieval junk food was rough, practical, or potentially dangerous. Some of it was downright elegant. Enter the world of medieval confectionery, where skilled artisans created treats that would make modern chocolatiers weep with envy. These weren't your average street vendors slinging questionable meat pies. These were specialists, artists who had elevated sugar and spice into something approaching high art. Let me introduce you to Master Guillaume, a confectioner who operates out of a small but immaculately clean workshop just off the main thoroughfare. Guillaume isn't selling to dock workers or tired merchants. His customers are nobles, wealthy clergy, and anyone else with enough coins to afford what he's offering. And what he's offering is nothing short of magical. Guillaume specializes in something called sucket, which is essentially candied fruit taken to an almost absurd level of refinement. But calling it candied fruit is like calling a Rolls-Royce a car. Technically accurate, but missing the point entirely. The process begins with the finest fruits Guillaume can acquire. Oranges from Spain, dates from North Africa, ginger root from places so distant that most of his customers have never heard their names. These aren't the small tart apples that Agnes uses for her fritters. These are exotic treasures that have travelled thousands of miles to end up in Guillaume's workshop. Each piece of fruit is carefully prepared, peeled, sectioned, cleaned until it's perfect. Then comes the real magic. Guillaume has mastered the art of creating sugar syrup at different concentrations, something that requires precise timing, careful temperature control, and years of experience to get right. The fruit is submerged in this syrup and heated gently, slowly, patiently. Then it's removed, drained, and the process is repeated with a stronger syrup, and then again and again. Sometimes this process takes days, with Guillaume checking on his precious fruits multiple times, adjusting temperatures, testing consistencies, making tiny modifications that only he can perceive. What emerges from this painstaking process is something that barely resembles the original fruit. It's translucent, jewel-like, coated in a hard shell of crystallized sugar that cracks between your teeth before releasing an explosion of concentrated flavor that's both familiar and completely transformed. A piece of Guillaume's sucket doesn't just taste like an orange. It tastes like the essence of orange, the platonic ideal of orange, orange as it exists in some perfect realm, where flavor and sweetness and texture combine in ways that seem almost supernatural. But here's the thing about Guillaume's sucket. It's not just expensive, it's stupidly expensive. A single piece might cost more than a laborer makes in a week. This isn't food for survival or even simple pleasure. This is food as status symbol, as art object, as a way of demonstrating that you have so much money you can afford to spend it on something that serves no practical purpose beyond pure indulgence. And yet, Guillaume has no shortage of customers, because even in the Middle Ages, even in a world where most people struggled just to get enough calories to survive, there were always people willing to pay outrageous amounts for something truly extraordinary. Lady Catherine, the wife of a successful wool merchant, approaches Guillaume's workshop with the kind of careful deliberation that suggests she's about to make a significant purchase. She's dressed in fine fabrics, her hair arranged in the elaborate style that marks her as someone of means, and she's accompanied by a young servant who carries her purse and looks suitably impressed by the surroundings. "Master Guillaume," she says, with the kind of polite formality that wealthy people use when they want to establish their social position. "I'm hosting a dinner party next week for some visiting dignitaries from France. I need something special, something that will demonstrate our city's sophistication." Guillaume's eyes light up. This is exactly the kind of commission he lives for. "My lady, I have just the thing. I've been working on some candied ginger root that I believe will exceed your expectations. The process takes 7 days of careful preparation, and the flavor is unlike anything your guests will have experienced." He leads her to a cabinet where rows of glass jars display his creations like precious gems. Each piece of sucket is perfectly formed, glowing with an inner light that makes them look more like jewelry than food. Lady Catherine examines them carefully, her expert eye assessing not just their appearance, but their potential impact on her social standing. "How much?" she asks, though her tone suggests that price is less important than quality. "For a selection suitable for 12 guests, 30 silver pieces," Guillaume replies without hesitation. It's an enormous sum, but he knows his market. Lady Catherine nods without blinking. "Perfect. I'll also need them presented properly, something that will showcase their beauty." "Of course, my lady. I have silver dishes designed specifically for this purpose. Each piece will be arranged to complement the others, creating a display that will be as visually stunning as it is delicious." This interaction reveals something important about medieval junk food culture. While most of what we've been discussing serves practical needs, hunger, convenience, basic pleasure, there's also a luxury tier that serves entirely different functions. Guillaume's sucket isn't about nutrition or even simple enjoyment. It's about power, status, and the ability to command resources that most people can't even imagine. But it's also about something else. It's about the human desire to push boundaries, to take simple ingredients and transform them into something transcendent. Guillaume isn't just a businessman selling candy. He's an artist using sugar and fruit as his medium, creating experiences that exist nowhere else in the world. This artistic impulse shows up throughout medieval food culture, even in much simpler contexts. The elaborate patterns on waffle irons, the careful spicing of gingerbread, the decorative arrangements of Hassan's halva, all of these represent attempts to elevate food beyond mere sustenance into something approaching art. As Lady Catherine completes her purchase and departs with her servant in tow, we notice that Guillaume's success has attracted attention from other food artisans in the area. Competition in the luxury food market is fierce, and everyone is constantly looking for ways to differentiate their products and justify premium prices. Just down the street, a baker named Pierre has been experimenting with something he calls marchpane, which is essentially an early form of marzipan. Pierre starts with almonds, expensive imported nuts that he grinds by hand into the finest possible powder. This almond flour is then mixed with honey and rosewater, kneaded until it forms a smooth, pliable paste that can be shaped into virtually any form. But Pierre doesn't just make simple shapes. He's learned to create elaborate sculptures, miniature castles, detailed flowers, even tiny replicas of animals, all made entirely from his almond paste. These aren't just confections, they're edible art pieces that blur the line between food and decoration. The process of making marchpane requires incredible skill and patience. The almonds must be blanched, peeled, and ground to exactly the right consistency. Too coarse, and the paste will be grainy. Too fine, and it becomes difficult to work with. The honey must be added in precise amounts, enough to bind the mixture, but not so much that it becomes sticky or overly sweet. The rosewater provides both flavor and aroma, but it must be used sparingly. Too much, and it overwhelms the delicate almond taste. Too little, and the paste lacks complexity. Pierre has spent years perfecting these ratios, and the results speak for themselves. His marchpane sculptures are works of art that happen to be edible. A miniature castle might take him hours to complete, with tiny battlements, detailed windows, even microscopic flags flying from the towers. A rose might require dozens of individual petals, each one shaped by hand and assembled with the patience of a master craftsman. These creations are displayed in Pierre's shop window, like precious artifacts, and they draw crowds of admirers, even from people who could never afford to buy them. Children press their faces against the glass, marveling at the tiny details. Adults shake their heads in amazement at the skill required to create such things. But Pierre's marchpane serves another function beyond pure artistry. It's become a status symbol among the wealthy, a way of demonstrating not just financial resources but cultural sophistication. Commissioning a custom marchpane sculpture for a special event is a way of showing that you appreciate fine craftsmanship and are willing to pay for it. A young nobleman named Sir Edmund approaches Pierre's shop with a specific request. His daughter is getting married next month, and he wants something special for the wedding feast, something that will be remembered and talked about for years to come. "I need a centerpiece," Sir Edmund explains, "something that represents the union of our two families. Perhaps two swans, necks intertwined, sitting on a lake with lilies around them." Pierre nods thoughtfully, already visualizing the piece in his mind. "It can be done, but it will take time. The detail work alone will require several days, and I'll need to create special tools for some of the finer elements." "Cost is not a concern," Sir Edmund says, though Pierre notices he doesn't ask for a specific price. "This is my only daughter's wedding. I want it to be perfect." This is how the luxury food market works in medieval times. Price is often less important than uniqueness, craftsmanship, and the ability to create something that no one else has. Pierre's marchpane sculptures aren't just desserts, they're conversation pieces, memory makers, symbols of the customer's taste and resources. But the influence of these luxury foods extends far beyond their immediate consumers. Techniques developed for expensive confections eventually filter down to more affordable foods. Decorative patterns, flavor combinations, presentation methods, all of these innovations eventually influence the broader food culture. A humble street vendor might not be able to afford rosewater or imported almonds, but they can learn to arrange their simpler wares in more attractive ways. They can experiment with local herbs to create more complex flavors. They can take inspiration from luxury techniques and adapt them to their own circumstances and customer base. This trickle-down effect is how food culture evolves, how innovations spread from the cutting edge to the mainstream. Medieval luxury confectioners like Guillaume and Pierre aren't just serving wealthy customers, they're pushing the boundaries of what's possible with food, creating techniques and concepts that will eventually benefit everyone. As we continue our journey through medieval London's food scene, we encounter something that might seem familiar to modern eyes, but represents a completely different approach to portable nutrition. Near the edge of the market area, close to where the city meets the countryside, we find vendors specializing in what we might recognize as early energy bars. These aren't the processed, packaged protein bars you'd find in a modern convenience store. Instead, they're dense, nutrient-packed confections made from nuts, dried fruits, honey, and sometimes grains, all pressed together into portable blocks that can sustain travelers, laborers, or anyone else who needs concentrated nutrition on the go. The woman making these treats is called Beatrice, and she's perfected a recipe that balances nutrition, flavor, and practicality in ways that would impress modern food scientists. Her basic mixture starts with almonds and walnuts, both expensive but packed with the kind of fats and proteins that provide sustained energy. These nuts are chopped roughly, not ground fine like Pierre's marchpane ingredients, because texture is important in these survival foods. To the nuts, Beatrice adds dried fruits, figs, and dates when she can get them, sometimes dried apples or pears from local orchards. These provide natural sugars for quick energy and help bind the mixture together. The sweetness also makes the finished product more palatable, which is important when you're trying to create something that people will actually want to eat during long journeys or hard labor. Honey serves as both sweetener and binding agent, but Beatrice uses it sparingly. Too much honey makes the bars sticky and difficult to handle. Too little and they fall apart. She's learned through years of experimentation exactly how much honey to use for different weather conditions, because humidity affects how the mixture behaves. Sometimes Beatrice adds oats or barley, grains that provide additional carbohydrates and help stretch the expensive nuts to make the bars more affordable. These grains are toasted first to improve their flavor and texture, then mixed in at just the right stage of the process to ensure even distribution. The final ingredient is salt, just a pinch, but it's crucial. Salt enhances all the other flavors and provides essential minerals that the body needs, especially during physical exertion. Medieval people understood the importance of salt in ways that we've largely forgotten, and Beatrice's careful use of it demonstrates this knowledge. The mixing process is done by hand in a large wooden bowl, with Beatrice using her fingers to ensure that every ingredient is evenly distributed. The mixture is then pressed into wooden molds and left to set for several hours until it firms up enough to hold its shape when cut. The finished bars are dense, chewy, and intensely flavorful. They're not particularly sweet by modern standards, but they're satisfying in a way that processed foods rarely achieve. Each bar contains enough nutrition to sustain a person for hours of physical activity, and they can last for weeks without spoiling if kept dry. Beatrice's customers are a different crowd from those who frequent Guillaume's luxury confectionery, or even Agnes's apple fritters. These are practical people who need practical food. Pilgrims preparing for long journeys to holy sites, merchants planning trading expeditions, soldiers heading off to distant campaigns, workers who need something substantial to eat during long shifts. A group of pilgrims approaches Beatrice's stall, easily identifiable by their simple robes, walking staffs, and the kind of determined expression that suggests they're about to undertake something significant. Their leader, a middle-aged man named Brother Francis, examines Beatrice's wares with the careful attention of someone who understands the importance of good provisions. "How long will these keep?" he asks, hefting one of the bars to test its weight and density. "Properly stored, at least a month," Beatrice replies. "I've had customers take them on journeys to Rome and beyond without any problems. The key is keeping them dry and wrapped properly." Brother Francis nods approvingly. He's been on enough pilgrimages to know that food can make the difference between a successful journey and a disaster. "We'll need enough for 12 people, 3 weeks on the road." Beatrice quickly calculates the quantity needed, factoring in not just the number of people and days, but also the physical demands of long-distance walking and the likelihood that they'll be able to supplement these rations with other foods along the way. 48 bars should be sufficient, she says, but I'd recommend 54 to be safe. Better to have too much than too little when you're days away from the nearest market. The transaction that follows is more than just a business deal. Beatrice carefully wraps each bar in cloth, then packs them in a wooden box designed to protect them from moisture and rough handling. She provides detailed instructions on how to store them, how to recognize signs of spoilage, and how to ration them effectively during the journey. This level of care and expertise demonstrates something important about medieval food culture. Even the most practical, utilitarian foods were created by people who understood their craft deeply and took pride in their work. Beatrice isn't just selling energy bars, she's providing a service that could literally save lives. The Pilgrim's Purchase also illustrates how medieval travel created demand for specialized foods. Long-distance journeys were dangerous undertakings that required careful planning and preparation. The right provisions could mean the difference between reaching your destination safely and never being seen again. But it's not just long-distance travelers who need portable, nutritious food. Medieval cities are full of people whose work keeps them away from home for extended periods. Craftsmen working on construction projects, guards patrolling city walls, merchants setting up at distant markets. All of these people need food that they can carry with them and eat without preparation. A young stonemason named Thomas approaches Beatrice's stall, still covered in dust from his work on a new church being built across the city. He's been working 12-hour days, and the walk home for lunch isn't practical. He needs something that will keep his energy up through the afternoon without requiring him to stop work or find cooking facilities. Something that won't crumble in my tool bag, Thomas says, examining Beatrice's selection. And that won't go bad if I don't eat it today. Beatrice selects one of her denser bars, made with extra honey and pressed more firmly than the others. This one should work perfectly. Dense enough to survive rough handling, sweet enough to give you energy when you need it most. Thomas pays for several bars, enough to last him through the week. For him, these aren't exotic treats or special occasion foods. They're practical tools, as essential to his work as his hammer and chisel. This utilitarian approach to food represents another important aspect of medieval eating culture. While we've seen luxury confections and indulgent treats, much of medieval food culture was driven by practical necessity. People needed foods that would keep them alive and working under difficult conditions. The fact that these foods could also be flavorful and satisfying was a bonus, but the primary requirement was functionality. This practical approach led to innovations that we still use today. The combination of nuts, dried fruits, and honey that forms the basis of Beatrice's energy bars is essentially the same formula used in modern trail mix and protein bars. The understanding that certain combinations of ingredients provide sustained energy while remaining portable and shelf-stable represents sophisticated nutritional knowledge developed through centuries of trial and error. As the afternoon progresses and our exploration of medieval London's food scene continues, we begin to encounter vendors who specialize in what we might call comfort foods. These aren't the practical energy bars designed for travelers, nor the luxury confections created for wealthy customers. Instead, they're foods that provide emotional satisfaction, treats that make difficult lives a little more bearable. One such vendor is an elderly woman named Goodwife Martha, who has spent decades perfecting recipes for what she calls soul cakes. These are small, round pastries traditionally made for All Souls' Day, but Martha has discovered that people crave them year-round, especially during cold weather or difficult times. Martha's soul cakes are deceptively simple. Made from flour, butter, eggs and spices, they're formed into small rounds and marked with a cross before baking. But the simplicity is misleading. The proportions must be exact, the spices carefully balanced, the baking time precisely controlled. Too much flour, and they're dry. Too little, and they fall apart. Too much spice, and they're overwhelming. Too little, and they're bland. What makes Martha's soul cakes special isn't just their flavor, though that's certainly part of it. It's the memories and emotions they evoke. These are foods that connect people to their childhood, to religious traditions, to family gatherings, and community celebrations. Eating one of Martha's soul cakes isn't just about nutrition or even pleasure. It's about belonging, about being part of something larger than yourself. a young woman named Alice approaches Martha's stall with tears in her eyes. She's recently arrived in London from a small village, looking for work and finding the city overwhelming and lonely. The smell of Martha's baking reminds her of home, of her grandmother's kitchen, of a time when she felt safe and loved. "How much for one?" Alice asks, though she's clearly counting her coins carefully. Martha looks at the young woman and sees herself decades earlier, when she first came to the city as a frightened girl with no family and few prospects. "For you, dear, just a halfpenny, and take another for later. You look like you could use some comfort." This small act of kindness illustrates something important about medieval food culture. While much of what we've discussed has been commercial, transactional, focused on profit and efficiency, there's also a deeply human element. Food vendors aren't just business people. They're members of communities. People who understand that sometimes a warm pastry can provide more than just calories. Alice bites into her soul cake and immediately starts crying harder, but now her tears are mixed with relief and gratitude. The familiar flavors transport her back to her childhood, reminding her that she's not as alone as she feels. Martha pretends not to notice the tears, busying herself with arranging her remaining cakes. But her kindness has created a connection that transcends the simple exchange of money for food. This emotional dimension of food is something we sometimes forget in our modern world of processed convenience foods. But in medieval times, when most food was made by hand by people you knew, every meal carried emotional weight. The baker who made your bread, the woman who sold you fritters, the confectioner who created special treats for your wedding. These weren't anonymous corporate entities. They were neighbours, community members, people who shared your struggles and celebrated your successes. As evening approaches and the street vendors begin to pack up their wares, we encounter one final category of medieval junk food that deserves attention. These are the foods associated with festivals, celebrations, and special occasions, foods that appear only at certain times of year or in connection with specific events, creating anticipation and marking the passage of time. One such vendor is Master John, a pastry maker who specializes in what he calls festival cakes. These are elaborate confections designed for specific religious holidays, each one carefully crafted to reflect the themes and traditions of its associated celebration. Master John doesn't just make these cakes year-round. Instead, he follows the religious calendar, creating different specialties for different seasons. During Lent, when meat is forbidden and people are supposed to be fasting, Master John makes simple, humble cakes, sweetened only with honey and flavored with herbs. These aren't indulgent treats, but they provide a small comfort during a time of deprivation and self-denial. For Easter, he creates elaborate egg-shaped confections decorated with intricate patterns and filled with sweet custards. These celebrate the end of Lent and the resurrection of Christ, representing rebirth and renewal through their very form and flavour. At Christmas, Master John's specialty is a dense, fruit-laden cake that's meant to be aged for weeks before eating. This cake is so rich and heavily spiced that a small slice provides intense satisfaction, and its long preparation time makes it a symbol of patience and anticipation. But perhaps most interesting are the cakes Master John makes for local festivals and celebrations that have nothing to do with religious observance. When the city celebrates a military victory, he creates patriotic confections decorated with heraldic symbols. When a noble couple gets married, he makes wedding cakes that tell the story of their courtship in sugar and spice. These festival foods serve multiple functions beyond simple nutrition or pleasure. They mark time, creating shared experiences that bind communities together. They preserve traditions, passing cultural knowledge from one generation to the next. They provide occasions for indulgence that might otherwise be considered sinful or excessive. Most importantly, they remind us that even in a world where survival was often uncertain and pleasure was rare, people still found ways to celebrate, to create beauty, to mark the passage of time with special foods that elevated ordinary moments into something memorable. A group of children approaches Master John's stall, drawn by the colourful decorations on his festival cakes. They don't have money to buy anything, but Master John recognises the look of fascination in their eyes. He's been where they are, marvelling at treats he couldn't afford, dreaming of someday being able to taste such wonders. "Would you like to know how these are made?" he asks the children, who nod eagerly. Master John begins explaining his craft, showing them how he mixes colours from natural ingredients, how he shapes decorative elements, how he balances flavours to create complex tastes. This informal education is another important function of medieval food culture. Skills and knowledge are passed down not through formal schools or written manuals, but through observation, conversation, and hands-on experience. These children might not remember everything Master John tells them, but some of them will carry the knowledge forward, perhaps becoming bakers themselves someday. As the sun sets over our medieval London street scene and the last vendors pack up their wares, we can step back and see the full picture of what we've been witnessing. This isn't just a collection of people selling food to other people. It's a complex social and economic ecosystem that serves multiple functions simultaneously. The food vendors we've met aren't just entrepreneurs trying to make a living. They're artists, craftspeople, community members, and informal teachers. They provide not just nutrition, but comfort, pleasure, status, and connection. They preserve traditions while also innovating and experimenting. They serve practical needs while also fulfilling emotional and social functions. Their customers aren't just consumers looking for convenient calories. They're people seeking comfort in difficult times, adventure in monotonous lives, connection to their communities, and ways to mark special occasions. They're participants in a food culture that's both deeply local and surprisingly cosmopolitan, both traditional and constantly evolving. The foods themselves aren't just primitive versions of modern snacks. They're sophisticated responses to the constraints and opportunities of their time. They demonstrate remarkable creativity within limited resources, deep understanding of nutrition and preservation, and appreciation for the social and emotional dimensions of eating. Perhaps most importantly, this medieval food culture reminds us that the human relationship with food hasn't changed as much as we might think. The desire for convenient, flavorful, emotionally satisfying food is as old as civilization itself. The only thing that's really changed is our methods and our scale. The dock worker grabbing a quick meat pie before his shift, the merchant's wife seeking exotic flavors to impress her friends, the traveler stocking up on portable nutrition for a long journey, the child dreaming of sweets they can't afford. All of these people would recognize their modern counterparts immediately. We like to think that our modern food culture, with its global supply chains and processed convenience foods, represents something entirely new in human history. But the truth is, we're just the latest chapter in a story that's been going on for thousands of years. The tools have changed, the ingredients have expanded, the scale has grown enormous, but the underlying human motivations remain exactly the same. And maybe, just maybe, understanding this continuity can help us appreciate both where we've come from and where we're going. The next time you grab a quick snack from a convenience store or treat yourself to something sweet from a fancy bakery, remember Margot and her questionable meat pies, Guillaume and his jewel-like sucket, Beatrice and her practical energy bars. You're participating in the same ancient human tradition of using food to satisfy not just hunger, but the deeper needs of comfort, pleasure, and connection. But our journey through medieval junk food isn't complete until we venture beyond the familiar streets of London. Because while English cookshops were serving their questionable meat pies and sweet fritters, entirely different food cultures were developing their own versio of fast, convenient, indulgent eating. And some of these traditions would make even the most adventurous modern foodie pause and reconsider their definition of exotic cuisine. Let's travel east, across the Channel, through the forests and mountains of continental Europe. past the great trading cities of Venice and Constantinople, until we reach the bustling markets of medieval Baghdad. Here, in the heart of the Islamic world, street food culture had evolved in directions that would seem both familiar and utterly alien to our London vendors. The year is 1247, and the Abbasid Caliphate may be past its golden age, but Baghdad is still one of the largest, most sophisticated cities in the world. The streets are filled with merchants from every corner of the known world, scholars debating philosophy in multiple languages, and most importantly for our purposes, food vendors who have access to ingredients that European cooks can barely imagine. Meet Hakim ibn Yusuf, a street vendor who specializes in something he calls lukmat al-qadi, which translates roughly to judge's morsels. These are small balls of sweet dough that are fried until golden and then soaked in honey syrup, flavored with rosewater and orange blossom. To modern palates, they'd be recognizable as an ancestor of Greek lukumads or Middle Eastern awameh. But in 13th century Baghdad, they represent the cutting edge of sophisticated street food. Hakim's setup is more elaborate than anything we saw in London. He has multiple pots of oil bubbling over carefully tended fires, each maintained at a different temperature for different stages of cooking. His dough is mixed fresh throughout the day, using a recipe that's been passed down through his family for generations. The honey syrup is a complex creation that requires precise timing and temperature control to achieve the right consistency. But what really sets Hakim apart from his European counterparts is his access to ingredients. The rosewater comes from Damascus, famous throughout the medieval world for the quality of its roses. The orange blossom water is distilled from trees that grow in the gardens of Cordoba, thousands of miles to the west. The honey itself comes from bees that feed on wildflowers in the mountains of Persia, giving it a complex floral character that transforms the simple fried dough into something transcendent. The process of making lukmat al-qadi is almost ritualistic in its precision. Hakim starts with a yeast-based dough that must be allowed to rise for exactly the right amount of time. Too little, and the interior will be dense. Too much, and the dough becomes difficult to handle. The oil temperature is critical, hot enough to create the proper texture, but not so hot that the outside burns before the inside cooks through. Using a special spoon with a rounded bowl, Hakim drops small portions of dough into the oil, where they immediately begin to puff and turn golden. The timing is crucial here. Each piece must be turned at exactly the right moment to ensure even cooking. Too early, and they'll collapse. Too late, and they'll become tough and chewy. As the dough balls emerge from the oil, they're immediately plunged into the honey syrup, where they absorb the sweet, fragrant liquid while still hot. The contrast between the crispy exterior and the soft, honey-soaked interior creates a textural experience that's both familiar and surprising. A young scholar named Abdullah approaches Hakim's stall, drawn by the intoxicating aroma of frying dough and floral honey. Abdullah spends his days in the House of Wisdom, studying translations of Greek philosophical texts, and these sweet treats have become his preferred method of sustaining himself during long hours of intellectual work. The usual portion, Hakim asks, already reaching for his serving bowl. He's been feeding scholars like Abdullah for years and understands their needs. They want something sweet enough to provide energy for mental work, but not so heavy that it makes them sleepy. Actually, make it a double portion today, Abdullah replies. I'm working on a particularly difficult translation, and I suspect I'll be at it well into the night. Hakim nods and prepares a generous serving, arranging the golden spheres in a bowl and drizzling them with extra syrup. But he also adds something special, a sprinkle of crushed pistachios that adds both flavor and texture to the dish. This isn't just customer service, it's an expression of artistry, a demonstration of the sophisticated food culture that Baghdad has developed over centuries of cultural exchange and innovation. This kind of attention to detail and customer relationship, illustrates something important about medieval Middle Eastern food culture. It's not just about feeding people quickly and cheaply. It's about creating experiences, building relationships, and maintaining standards that reflect the cultural sophistication of the Islamic world during its golden age. But Abdullah's pistachio-dusted Luqmat al-Qadi represents just one small corner of Baghdad's incredible street food scene. As he walks away, savouring his purchase, we notice other vendors whose offerings would seem like science fiction to our London cookshop owners. There's Fatima, who specialises in something called muhalabia, a delicate pudding made from rice flour, milk and sugar, flavoured with rosewater and topped with crushed almonds. She serves it in small clay bowls that customers return after eating, creating a kind of medieval recycling system that keeps costs down while maintaining presentation standards. Next to her is Ahmad, whose specialty is katayef, small pancakes that are filled with sweetened cheese or nuts, then folded and fried until crispy. The technique required to make these properly is extraordinary. The pancakes must be cooked on only one side initially, so they remain flexible enough to fold without breaking. The filling must be prepared to exactly the right consistency, sweet enough to be indulgent, but not so sweet that it overwhelms the delicate pancake. The final frying must be done at precisely the right temperature to crisp the outside without making the inside tough. These aren't just random street snacks. They're sophisticated culinary creations that demonstrate the advanced state of medieval Islamic cuisine. The techniques involved, the quality of ingredients, the attention to presentation, all of this reflects a food culture that's far more developed than anything we encountered in London. But perhaps most remarkable is a vendor named Khalil, who has somehow managed to create what he calls ice cream. Now, this isn't ice cream as we know it. There are no mechanical freezers, no industrial dairy processing, no artificial flavouring. Instead, Khalil has mastered the art of using natural ice and salt to create frozen desserts that would seem miraculous to people from warmer climates. The process starts with snow, carefully collected from the mountains outside the city and stored in underground chambers lined with straw and cloth. This snow is mixed with salt, creating a mixture cold enough to freeze other substances. Khalil then takes sweetened milk, flavoured with rosewater or fruit syrups, and places it in metal containers that are buried in the snow-salt mixture. The constant stirring required to prevent ice crystals from forming is backbreaking work, but the result is something that seems to defy the natural order. In a climate where summer temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit, Khalil is serving frozen desserts that provide relief from the heat while delivering intense flavours that seem enhanced by the cold. A group of merchants from India approaches Khalil's stall, drawn by curiosity about this impossible treat. They've travelled thousands of miles along trade routes that connect the known world, but they've never encountered anything like this frozen confection. "How is this possible?" asks Rajesh, the group's leader, examining the frozen dessert with the kind of wonder usually reserved for religious miracles. Khalil grins, enjoying the reaction he gets from first-time customers. "It's all about understanding how cold works," he explains, though he's careful not to reveal too many trade secrets. The right combination of ice, salt, and patience can create wonders. The Indian merchants purchase several servings, not just because they're curious about the taste, but because they recognize a business opportunity. If this technique could be replicated in their home cities, it would revolutionize summer food culture in ways that could generate enormous profits. This interaction illustrates something crucial about medieval food culture that we often overlook. These aren't isolated local traditions developing in isolation. They're part of a global network of trade, exchange, and innovation that's constantly spreading new ideas, techniques, and ingredients across vast distances. The spices that flavour Khalil's frozen desserts come from the same Indian merchants who are now learning his techniques. The sugar that sweetens Hakim's Luqmat al-Qadi was refined, using methods developed in India and improved by Islamic scholars. The rosewater that perfumes Fatima's muhalabia comes from techniques perfected in Damascus, but originally learned from Persian masters. This global exchange of culinary knowledge is creating a medieval food culture that's far more sophisticated and interconnected than most people realize. While European cookshops are still struggling with basic food safety and limited ingredient selection, Middle Eastern vendors are creating complex, refined treats that demonstrate advanced understanding of chemistry, temperature control, and flavor combination. But it's not just about sophistication, it's also about accessibility. Despite the exotic ingredients and complex techniques, many of these Middle Eastern street foods are surprisingly affordable. The economic model is different from what we saw in London, where luxury foods were priced out of reach for most people. In Baghdad, the large volume of trade and the sophisticated agricultural systems of the Islamic world have made many ingredients more widely available. Sugar, while still expensive, isn't the impossible luxury it is in Europe. Spices, nuts, and fruits that would bankrupt a London merchant are common enough that street vendors can use them in everyday preparations. This creates a food culture where even working-class people can occasionally afford treats that would be considered luxuries in other parts of the world. A dock worker in Baghdad might not be able to afford Khalil's frozen desserts every day, but he can certainly enjoy Hakim's honey-soaked dough balls as a regular indulgence. As our Middle Eastern food tour continues, we encounter vendors whose specialties reflect the region's unique position at the crossroads of multiple civilizations. There's Ibrahim, who makes a confection called halva, using techniques learned from Turkish merchants, ingredients sourced from Persian traders, and presentation methods borrowed from Byzantine confectioners. Ibrahim's halva isn't the simple sesame paste we might recognize today. It's a complex creation that combines groundnuts, honey, sugar, and various flavorings into dense, sweet blocks that can be cut into portions and sold individually. The process requires precise temperature control and timing that Ibrahim has spent years perfecting. The base starts with sesame seeds that must be roasted to exactly the right degree. Too little roasting, and the flavor will be bland. Too much, and it becomes bitter. The seeds are then ground in a stone mill until they form a smooth paste, a process that can take hours of careful work. Meanwhile, honey and sugar are heated together in a copper pot, stirred constantly to prevent burning. The temperature must be monitored carefully, using techniques that medieval Middle Eastern confectioners have developed over centuries. When the syrup reaches the right consistency, it's combined with the sesame paste and mixed thoroughly. But Ibrahim doesn't stop there. He adds rosewater for fragrance, chopped pistachios for texture, and sometimes a touch of saffron for color and flavor. The mixture is then pressed into wooden molds and left to cool until it's firm enough to cut. The finished halva is unlike anything available in medieval Europe. It's intensely sweet, but also complex, with layers of flavor that reveal themselves as you eat. The texture is smooth but not uniform, with the chopped nuts providing contrast and interest. The rosewater adds a floral note that elevates the entire experience beyond simple sweetness. A young woman named Zara approaches Ibrahim's stall, but her interaction with the vendor reveals another important aspect of medieval Middle Eastern food culture. Unlike in Europe, where women's participation in food commerce is often limited, Zara is clearly a knowledgeable customer who understands quality and isn't afraid to negotiate. "This halva," she says, examining a piece carefully. "The pistachios look fresh, but I can't smell much rose. Are you using enough rosewater?" Ibrahim nods respectfully. Zara is a regular customer whose family runs a successful textile business, and her opinion carries weight in the community. "You're right, of course. This batch was made yesterday, and the rose scent fades quickly. Let me cut you a piece from this morning's preparation." He produces a different tray, and immediately the difference is apparent. The aroma is more intense, the color slightly different, the overall presentation more appealing. Zara nods approvingly and makes her purchase. But the interaction demonstrates the sophisticated palate and high expectations that characterize medieval Middle Eastern food culture. This level of customer knowledge and vendor expertise creates a competitive environment that drives constant innovation and quality improvement. Vendors can't get away with using inferior ingredients or sloppy techniques because their customers will notice immediately and take their business elsewhere. As we continue exploring Baghdad's food scene, we encounter something that would seem completely impossible to medieval Europeans. A vendor who specializes in cold drinks. Not just cool drinks, but actually cold beverages served with chunks of ice. This vendor, named Yusuf, has developed a system for creating and serving cold drinks that represents one of the most advanced examples of medieval food technology. He starts with the same ice storage techniques that Khalil uses for his frozen desserts. But instead of making ice cream, Yusuf creates refreshing beverages that provide relief from the desert heat. His basic drink is a mixture of fruit syrups, water, and various flavorings, served over crushed ice in clay cups. But the variety of syrups he offers is staggering. Pomegranate, date, grape, apricot, rose, orange blossom, mint, and dozens of other flavors, each one prepared using techniques that maximize flavor while creating appealing colors and aromas. The process of making these syrups is incredibly labor-intensive. Fruits must be selected at peak ripeness, cleaned meticulously, and processed using methods that extract maximum flavor while removing any impurities. The cooking process requires constant attention and precise timing to achieve the right consistency and concentration, but the result is something that seems almost magical in the desert climate. A cold, flavorful drink that provides both physical relief from the heat and a burst of intense flavor that revives the spirit. For people accustomed to drinking warm water or lukewarm wine, Yusuf's cold beverages represent a revolutionary improvement in quality of life. A caravan of merchants from Central Asia stops at Yusuf's stall, their camels loaded with silk and spices bound for European markets. They've been traveling for weeks across harsh desert terrain, and the sight of Yusuf's ice-filled containers seems too good to be true. Cold drinks? Asks their leader, a weathered man named Osman who spent most of his adult life on the trade routes. In this heat? How is such a thing possible? Yusuf explains his ice storage system. Though like most medieval artisans, he's careful not to reveal all his trade secrets. The merchants are fascinated not just by the novelty, but by the business implications. If this technique could be adapted for use along the trade routes, it could transform the experience of desert travel. They purchase drinks for their entire party, and the reaction is immediate and enthusiastic. Men who've been suffering from heat exhaustion suddenly perk up, their energy restored by the combination of cold temperature and concentrated fruit flavors. Some of them start discussing whether they could convince Yusuf to travel with their caravan, bringing his ice-making techniques to other cities along their route. This kind of technology transfer is happening constantly in the medieval world, though we rarely think about it in those terms. Techniques developed in one location spread along trade routes, adapted to local conditions and ingredients, creating new traditions and possibilities in distant places. The cold drink technology that Yusuf has mastered will eventually spread westward, influencing the development of similar beverages in other parts of the Islamic world and beyond. The fruit syrup techniques will be adapted by confectioners in other cities, creating new types of sweets and preserves. The ice storage methods will be modified for different climates and applications, but perhaps most importantly, the very concept of cold refreshment in hot climates will change people's expectations about what's possible. Once you've experienced a truly cold drink on a scorching day, warm beverages will never seem adequate again. As our exploration of Baghdad's medieval food culture continues, we begin to understand that we're witnessing something historically significant. This isn't just street food culture. It's the foundation of culinary traditions that will influence cooking around the world for centuries to come. The techniques being developed here, the ingredients being combined, the presentation methods being perfected. All of this represents a level of sophistication that won't be matched in Europe for several more centuries. Medieval Islamic food culture is creating innovations that are genuinely ahead of their time. But it's not just about technical advancement. It's also about cultural attitudes toward food and eating. In Baghdad, food isn't just fuel for survival or even simple pleasure. It's an art form, a social activity, a way of demonstrating cultural sophistication and personal refinement. This attitude creates an environment where innovation flourishes, where vendors are encouraged to experiment and improve, where customers develop sophisticated palates and high expectations. The result is a food culture that's constantly evolving, constantly improving, constantly surprising. As the day progresses and we continue our journey through Baghdad's streets, we encounter vendors whose specialties reflect influences from even more distant cultures. There's Mahmoud, who learned noodle-making techniques from Chinese merchants and now serves a kind of medieval fast food that combines Middle Eastern spices with Far Eastern preparation methods. His noodles are hand-pulled, using techniques that require years to master, then served in broths flavored with combinations of spices that wouldn't be out of place in modern fusion cuisine. Saffron and star anise, cardamom and ginger, sumac and 5-spice powder, all combined in ways that create entirely new flavor profiles. The customers who frequent Mahmoud's stall represent the cosmopolitan nature of medieval Baghdad. Chinese merchants, Indian traders, Persian scholars, Arab locals, Jewish craftsmen, Christian pilgrims, all mixing together in pursuit of good food and interesting conversation. This diversity of customers creates demand for diverse flavors and preparation methods, encouraging vendors like Mahmoud to constantly experiment and adapt. A dish that appeals to Chinese palates might not work for Arab customers, so successful vendors learn to modify their preparations for different audiences. But they also learn from their customers, picking up new techniques, ingredients, and flavor combinations that they can incorporate into their own cooking. This constant exchange of culinary knowledge creates a dynamic food culture that's constantly evolving and improving. As evening approaches and the heat of the day begins to subside, we encounter a different category of medieval Middle Eastern street food, the treats associated with social gatherings and celebrations. These aren't everyday snacks meant for quick consumption by busy workers. Instead, they're special foods designed to enhance social experiences and mark important occasions. One such vendor is Fatima bint Ahmad, who specializes in what she calls celebration sweets. These are elaborate confections designed for weddings, religious festivals, and other special events. But Fatima has discovered that there's also a market for smaller versions of these treats, individual portions that allow ordinary people to experience luxury foods on a more modest scale. Her specialty is something called bird's nests, intricate confections made from extremely thin pastry that's been shaped into nest-like forms and filled with sweetened nuts and honey. The pastry work required to create these is extraordinarily difficult, requiring skills that take years to develop and hands steady enough to work with dough so thin it's almost transparent. The process starts with a basic dough made from flour, water, and a small amount of oil. But the technique for rolling and stretching this dough is what separates master confectioners from amateurs. The dough must be worked until it's elastic enough to stretch without tearing, then rolled so thin that you can read through it. This ultra-thin pastry is then carefully shaped into nest-like forms, filled with a mixture of chopped almonds, pistachios, and walnuts that have been sweetened with honey and flavored with rose water. The filled nests are then baked until the pastry is golden and crispy, while the nut filling remains moist and flavorful. The finished products look like works of art, delicate golden structures that seem too beautiful to eat. But the flavor matches the appearance, with the crispy pastry providing textural contrast to the rich, sweet filling. A young couple approaches Fatima's stall, clearly planning something special. They're well-dressed but not wealthy, probably craftspeople or minor merchants who want to celebrate an occasion but can't afford the full-scale confections that Fatima usually makes for wealthy customers. "We're celebrating our betrothal," the young man explains, clearly nervous about the expense, but determined to mark the occasion properly. We'd like something special, but we don't have a lot of money to spend. Fatima smiles, recognizing the universal desire to celebrate important moments with special food. I have just the thing, she says, selecting several of her smaller birds' nests and arranging them on a decorative tray. These will serve 4 people perfectly, and I'll include some of my honey cakes as well. She adds several small cakes to the tray, creates an attractive arrangement, and charges the couple a price that's generous but not insulting. This kind of flexible pricing allows her to serve different market segments while maintaining her reputation for quality and fairness. The couple leaves with their purchase, clearly delighted with both the food and the service. For them, these confections represent more than just dessert. They're symbols of celebration, markers of an important life transition, evidence that their relationship deserves special recognition. This social function of food is something we see throughout medieval culture, but it's particularly developed in the Islamic world, where hospitality and celebration are highly valued cultural traits. Food isn't just about nutrition or even pleasure. It's about expressing values, maintaining relationships, and marking the important moments that give life meaning. As our day in medieval Baghdad draws to a close, we can see that we've witnessed something remarkable. This isn't just a more sophisticated version of the London cookshops we encountered earlier. It's a fundamentally different approach to food culture, one that values artistry, innovation, and social connection in ways that create entirely different possibilities. The vendors we've met aren't just trying to feed people quickly and cheaply. They're creating experiences, building relationships, and participating in a cultural tradition that values excellence and constant improvement. Their customers aren't just buying calories or even simple pleasures. They're participating in a sophisticated food culture that offers experiences unavailable anywhere else in the medieval world. But Baghdad represents just one example of advanced medieval food culture. As trade routes connect different parts of the world, similar innovations are happening in other cities, other cultures, other contexts. To truly understand the scope of medieval junk food, we need to venture even further east, to places where entirely different ingredients and techniques are creating their own versions of portable, indulgent, convenient eating. Let's travel now to Song Dynasty China, where the year is 1265, and the city of Hangzhou has become one of the largest, most prosperous cities in the world. Marco Polo, who will visit this city in just a few years, will describe it as the finest and most splendid city in the world, and much of that splendor is reflected in its extraordinary food culture. The streets of Hangzhou are filled with vendors whose techniques and ingredients would seem like magic to both our London cookshop owners and our Baghdad confectioners. This is a culture that has been refining its culinary arts for thousands of years, and the results are nothing short of spectacular. Meet Li Wei, a vendor who specializes in something called tang hulu, which are fruits coated in crystallized sugar and served on bamboo skewers. But calling them simply candied fruit would be like calling a Chinese palace a house. The technique Li Wei uses to create his sugar coating is so advanced that it won't be duplicated in Europe for several more centuries. The process starts with fresh fruits, hawthorn berries being the traditional choice, though Li Wei also uses grapes, strawberries, and other seasonal options. These fruits are carefully selected for ripeness and quality, then cleaned and arranged on bamboo skewers in attractive patterns. The sugar coating is where Li Wei's artistry really shows. He heats sugar and water together in precise proportions, monitoring the temperature by dropping small amounts into cold water and observing how they behave. When the syrup reaches exactly the right consistency, he quickly dips each skewer of fruit, creating a glass-like coating that hardens almost immediately. The result is something that looks like jewelry and tastes like concentrated sunshine. The sugar coating cracks between your teeth, releasing the natural fruit flavors in a burst of sweetness that's both intense and refreshing. The bamboo skewer makes the treats portable and fun to eat, perfect for people walking through busy market streets. But Li Wei's Tanghulu represents just the beginning of Chinese medieval street food sophistication. Nearby, a vendor named Chen Ming specializes in xiaolongbao, small steamed dumplings filled with meat and broth that represent one of the most technically challenging street foods ever created. The technique required to make proper xiaolongbao is extraordinary. The wrapper must be rolled thin enough to be delicate but strong enough to hold liquid without leaking. The filling must be prepared with gelatin that will melt during steaming, creating broth inside the dumpling. The pleating technique used to close the dumplings requires years of practice to master. Chen Ming learned this craft from his father, who learned it from his father, in a tradition that stretches back generations. Each family has its own slight variations in technique and seasoning, creating subtle differences that regular customers can detect immediately. The cooking process is equally complex. The dumplings must be steamed at exactly the right temperature for exactly the right amount of time. Too hot, and they'll burst. Too cool, and they won't cook properly. Too long, and the wrappers become tough. Too short, and the filling remains raw. When done correctly, xiaolongbao are perfect little packages that contain an explosion of flavor and texture. The wrapper is silky and delicate. The filling is savory and satisfying, and the hot broth provides a surprise element that transforms the eating experience. A group of scholars from the Imperial Academy approaches Chen Ming's stall, drawn by the reputation of his dumplings. These are educated, sophisticated customers who understand quality and aren't easily impressed. But when they bite into Chen Ming's xiaolongbao, their reactions are immediate and enthusiastic. Perfect texture, comments one scholar, a man who has travelled extensively and eaten in the finest restaurants. The broth is properly seasoned, and the wrapper has exactly the right thickness. Chen Ming nods respectfully, pleased by the praise but not surprised. He knows his craft, and he knows that his dumplings represent the culmination of centuries of culinary refinement. This isn't just street food. It's edible art, created by master craftsmen using techniques that represent the pinnacle of human culinary achievement. But Chinese medieval food culture goes beyond individual technical excellence. It's also characterized by an understanding of balance, harmony, and the relationship between food and health that's far more sophisticated than anything we've encountered in other medieval cultures. Take, for example, Wang Shu, a vendor who specializes in douhua, a silky tofu pudding that can be served either sweet or savory, depending on the customer's preference and the time of day. Wang Shu's understanding of how different foods affect the body's balance reflects centuries of Chinese medical and culinary knowledge. For morning customers, Wang Shu might serve douhua with ginger syrup, believing that ginger helps activate the body's energy for the day ahead. For afternoon customers, he might use a lighter sweet syrup that provides energy without overwhelming the system. For evening customers, he might offer a savory version with vegetables and light seasonings that won't interfere with sleep. This isn't just random variation based on personal preference. It's a systematic approach to food that considers not just flavor and nutrition, but also the timing of consumption, the customer's apparent constitution, and the seasonal influences that affect human health. Wang Shu learned these principles through years of study with traditional Chinese medicine practitioners, and he applies them to his street food with the same care that a court physician might use in prescribing treatments for the emperor. This integration of medical knowledge with culinary practice creates a food culture that's simultaneously delicious and therapeutic. A middle-aged merchant named Liu Bei approaches Wang Shu's stall, looking tired and slightly unwell after a long journey from the northern provinces. Wang Shu examines his customer carefully, noting the signs of exhaustion and possible digestive issues that come from eating unfamiliar foods during travel. You need something cooling and gentle, Wang Shu decides, preparing a bowl of douhua with a light almond syrup and a small amount of fresh mint. This will settle your stomach and restore your energy without overwhelming your system. Liu Bei accepts the recommendation trustingly. He's heard about Wang Shu's reputation for understanding how food affects health, and he's curious to experience this integration of medicine and cuisine firsthand. The duhua is unlike anything Liu Bei has experienced before. The texture is impossibly silky, almost liquid, but with enough substance to be satisfying. The flavor is subtle and complex, with the almond syrup providing sweetness, while the mint adds a cooling sensation that seems to spread throughout his body. Within minutes of finishing the duhua, Liu Bei notices that he feels better. His stomach has settled, his energy has returned, and the general malaise that had been troubling him for days has largely disappeared. This isn't just food, it's medicine disguised as a delicious treat. This kind of sophisticated understanding of food's effects on health and well-being represents one of the highest achievements of medieval Chinese culture. While other civilizations are still thinking of food primarily in terms of basic nutrition and simple pleasure, Chinese cooks are creating street foods that serve multiple functions simultaneously. But Chinese medieval food culture also includes purely indulgent treats that prioritize pleasure over health benefits. There's Zhou Ming, who specializes in mahua, twisted fried dough that's been sweetened and flavored with various ingredients to create crispy, addictive snacks that serve no purpose beyond pure enjoyment. Zhou Ming's mahua comes in dozens of varieties, each one reflecting different regional influences and seasonal ingredients. Some are flavored with sesame seeds, others with honey, still others with various nuts and spices. The twisting technique used to shape them creates an intricate pattern that's both visually appealing and functionally important for achieving the right texture during frying. The frying process itself is an art form. The oil temperature must be precisely controlled to create the right balance between crispy exterior and tender interior. The timing must be exact to prevent burning while ensuring complete cooking. The draining process must remove excess oil without making the mahua soggy or greasy. The result is something that would be instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with modern Chinese snack foods. But in 13th century Hangzhou, Zhou Ming's mahua represents cutting-edge innovation in portable treats. The twisted shape makes them easy to carry and eat while walking. The frying process gives them excellent shelf life, and the variety of flavors means there's something to appeal to every palate. A group of young artisans approaches Zhou Ming's stall during their afternoon break from a nearby pottery workshop. Their hands are still dusty from clay, and they're looking for something quick and satisfying to restore their energy before returning to work. "What's fresh today?" asks their leader, a skilled potter named Huang Li, who's become a regular customer over the past months. Zhou Ming gestures to several baskets of freshly fried mahua, each variety carefully labeled and arranged for maximum visual appeal. "The honey sesame are particularly good today," he says, "and I just finished a batch with crushed walnuts that turned out perfectly." The artisans pool their money and buy an assortment, sharing different varieties as they walk back to their workshop. This communal approach to snacking is typical of Chinese food culture, where sharing and trying different flavors is considered part of the pleasure of eating. But what's particularly interesting about Zhou Ming's mahua is how they reflect the global influences that are shaping Chinese food culture during this period. The sesame seeds come from Central Asia, the honey might come from tribute payments from Southeast Asian kingdoms, and some of the spices he uses have traveled along the Silk Road from as far away as the Middle East. This international influence creates a Chinese street food culture that's simultaneously deeply traditional and surprisingly cosmopolitan. Vendors like Zhou Ming are constantly incorporating new ingredients and techniques while maintaining the fundamental principles of Chinese cooking that have been developed over millennia. As we continue exploring Hangzhou's medieval food scene, we encounter vendors whose specialties reflect the city's position as one of the world's great trading centers. There's Xu Dong, who has learned to make a kind of early ice cream using techniques similar to what we saw in Baghdad, but adapted for Chinese ingredients and tastes. Xu Dong's frozen treats are made with rice milk instead of dairy, sweetened with rock sugar, and flavored with ingredients like osmanthus flowers, green tea, and red bean paste. The techniques he uses are similar to Khalil's methods in Baghdad, but the cultural context and ingredient choices create entirely different flavor profiles and eating experiences. The rice milk base creates a texture that's lighter and less rich than dairy-based frozen desserts, while the floral and vegetable flavors reflect Chinese preferences for subtle, complex tastes that change as you eat them. The osmanthus flower flavor, in particular, starts with a light sweetness that gradually reveals deeper, more complex notes that seem to cleanse the palate rather than overwhelming it. But perhaps most remarkable is Shudong's understanding of temperature and texture. He's learned to create frozen desserts with different levels of hardness, from completely frozen treats that must be allowed to soften before eating, to semi-frozen slushes that can be consumed immediately, to barely chilled creams that provide cooling relief without shocking the system. This sophisticated understanding of how temperature affects both flavor and digestion reflects the same integration of culinary and medical knowledge that we saw with Wang Shu's Douhua. Chinese food culture doesn't just ask whether something tastes good. It also considers whether it's appropriate for the season, the time of day, the customer's apparent constitution, and the other foods they're likely to be eating. A wealthy merchant's wife named Lady Zhang approaches Shudong's stall, accompanied by her young daughter and several servants. She's heard about these frozen treats, but has never tried them, partly because she's uncertain whether they're appropriate for someone of her social status. "Are these suitable for refined palates?" she asks, clearly hoping for reassurance that she won't be compromising her dignity by eating street food. Shudong understands the social dynamics involved in his answer. While his frozen treats are technically street food, the quality of his ingredients and the sophistication of his techniques make them appropriate for customers of any social class. "My lady," he says respectfully, "I use only the finest rock sugar from Fujian province, osmanthus flowers picked at dawn when their fragrance is strongest, and rice milk prepared using methods learned from the imperial kitchens. These desserts are served in the homes of government officials and wealthy merchants throughout the city." Lady Zhang nods, satisfied that she won't be lowering herself by trying something common. She orders a selection of frozen treats, and Shudong carefully prepares small portions of his different varieties, arranging them in delicate porcelain bowls that enhance their presentation. Lady Zhang's daughter tries the osmanthus flower variety first, her eyes widening with delight at the unexpected combination of cold temperature and floral sweetness. "Mother, it's like eating a frozen garden," she exclaims, causing the adults to smile at her innocent enthusiasm. But Lady Zhang's reaction is more measured and analytical. She recognizes the quality of the ingredients, the sophistication of the preparation, and the careful attention to presentation that marks Shudong as a master of his craft. This isn't just street food, it's a refined culinary experience that happens to be available on the street. As the afternoon progresses and our exploration of Hangzhou's food culture continues, we begin to understand that we're witnessing something historically unprecedented. This isn't just the most advanced street food culture of its time. It may be the most advanced street food culture that has ever existed, combining technical excellence, artistic presentation, health consciousness, and social sophistication in ways that won't be matched again for centuries. The vendors we've encountered aren't just trying to make a living by feeding people. They're participating in a cultural tradition that values continuous improvement, innovation, and the integration of multiple types of knowledge. They understand not just cooking techniques, but also medicine, nutrition, seasonality, social dynamics, and aesthetic principles. Their customers aren't just buying food, they're participating in a sophisticated cultural experience that reflects centuries of refinement and development. They have educated palates, high expectations, and deep appreciation for quality and artistry. But perhaps most remarkably, this advanced food culture is accessible to people from many different social classes and economic backgrounds. While the wealthiest customers can afford the most expensive ingredients and elaborate presentations, the fundamental techniques and principles are available to almost everyone. A poor student can buy a simple bowl of douar and experience the same careful attention to balance and health that a wealthy merchant receives. A working artisan can purchase mahua made with the same frying techniques and quality standards that serve the imperial court. A traveling trader can enjoy tanghulu, created with the same sugar crystallization methods that produce treats for the highest levels of society. This democratization of sophisticated food culture creates an environment where innovation flourishes at every level. Street vendors are constantly experimenting with new techniques and ingredients because they know their customers will appreciate and reward quality. Customers develop increasingly sophisticated palates because they're regularly exposed to high-quality food. The entire system creates a positive feedback loop that drives continuous improvement. As evening approaches and the vendors begin to prepare for the end of another busy day, we can see the full scope of what medieval Chinese food culture has achieved. It's created a system that successfully balances tradition with innovation, individual artistry with social accessibility, pleasure with health consciousness, and local identity with international influence. But China represents just one example of advanced medieval food culture. Throughout the medieval world, different civilizations are developing their own sophisticated approaches to portable, convenient, indulgent eating. Each culture is working within its own constraints and opportunities, creating unique solutions to the universal human desire for food that's both practical and pleasurable. Our journey through medieval junk food has taken us from the rough, practical cookshops of London to the refined confectionaries of Baghdad to the technically advanced street vendors of Hangzhou. Along the way, we've discovered that the medieval world was far more sophisticated, interconnected, and innovative than most people realize. The foods we've encountered aren't primitive ancestors of modern snacks. They're sophisticated culinary achievements that represent the culmination of centuries of development and refinement. Many of the techniques, ingredients, and presentation methods we've seen are just as advanced as anything available today, and some are more sophisticated than their modern equivalents. But perhaps most importantly, we've learned that the human relationship with food hasn't changed as much as we might think. The medieval people we've met have the same desires, needs, and motivations that drive modern food culture. They want convenience, flavor, variety, social connection, and occasional indulgence. They use food to mark special occasions, express cultural identity, demonstrate social status, and create shared experiences. The only things that have really changed are the scale, the technology, and the global availability of ingredients. The fundamental human motivations remain exactly the same, connecting us across centuries to people who lived in completely different worlds, but shared our basic desires and needs. As we conclude our exploration of medieval junk food, it's worth reflecting on what this history teaches us about human nature, cultural development, and the role of food in society. The vendors and customers we've met weren't living in a primitive, backward age, waiting for modernity to rescue them. They were creating sophisticated, innovative, culturally rich food experiences that served multiple functions simultaneously. They fed people, created jobs, fostered innovation, facilitated cultural exchange, marked social occasions, preserved traditions, and provided moments of pleasure and comfort in lives that were often difficult and uncertain. In short, they were doing exactly what modern food culture does, just with different tools and in different contexts. The techniques they developed, the cultural practices they established, and the social functions they served created the foundation for everything that came after. Modern global food culture, with all its complexity and sophistication, grew directly from the seeds planted by medieval vendors selling fritters by the Thames, confectioners creating halva in Baghdad, and dumpling makers perfecting their craft in Hangzhou. Understanding this continuity helps us appreciate both where we've come from and where we might be going. The next time you grab a quick snack from a food truck, visit a specialty bakery, or try an exotic treat from a distant culture, remember that you're participating in traditions that stretch back over 1,000 years. You're connected to an unbroken chain of human creativity, innovation, and the simple desire to make life a little more delicious, one bite at a time. The medieval world may seem distant and foreign, but in the realm of food, we're still living in the same story, still driven by the same appetites, still searching for the same perfect balance of convenience, flavor, and satisfaction that has motivated human beings since we first learned to cook. And that's a pretty remarkable thing to chew on. But as the shadows lengthen and our final vendors begin packing their wares, there's one last stop we need to make on our medieval junk food journey. Because if we really want to understand how these ancient cravings connect to our modern world, we need to witness something that would seem almost impossible to medieval eyes, yet represents the natural evolution of everything we've experienced. Picture this. It's the year 1485, and we're standing in the great market square of Nuremberg, Germany. The medieval world is beginning to give way to something new, something that historians will later call the Renaissance. Trade routes are expanding, new ingredients are arriving from distant lands, and most importantly, new technologies are beginning to transform how food is made and sold. Standing before us is Klaus Zimmermann, a master baker whose workshop represents the cutting edge of late medieval food technology. Klaus has just installed something revolutionary in his bakery, a proper oven with temperature control mechanisms that allow him to regulate heat with unprecedented precision. This might not sound impressive to modern ears, but to medieval food producers, it's like getting access to a spaceship. "Watch this," Klaus says to a small crowd of curious onlookers, including several competing bakers who are trying to figure out how he's achieving such consistent results. He slides a tray of what he calls Lebkuchen into his new oven, small cakes made with honey, spices, and a secret ingredient that he's recently acquired through his connections with Mediterranean traders. That secret ingredient? Refined sugar. Not the coarse brownish stuff that's been trickling into European markets for decades, but actual white crystalline sugar that's been processed using techniques developed in the Islamic world and recently brought to Europe by Venetian merchants. The difference this refined sugar makes is dramatic. Klaus's Lebkuchen aren't just sweet, they're precisely sweet, with a clean, intense flavour that doesn't carry the sometimes harsh undertones of honey or the grittiness of unrefined sugar. They're also more stable, lasting longer without spoiling and maintaining their texture in ways that earlier sweeteners couldn't match. But Klaus isn't just using this refined sugar in traditional ways. He's experimenting, creating new confections that push the boundaries of what medieval sweets can be. His latest creation is something he calls Zuckerbrot, literally sugar bread, but what we might recognize as an early form of cake. The process Klaus uses to make Zuckerbrot represents the culmination of centuries of medieval baking knowledge combined with new ingredients and technologies. He starts with the finest wheat flour, sifted multiple times to remove any impurities. To this he adds eggs, butter, and his precious refined sugar, but the proportions and mixing techniques he uses reflect generations of accumulated wisdom about how these ingredients interact. The mixing is done by hand, using wooden spoons that have been passed down through his family for generations. Klaus can tell by the sound the batter makes, by the way it feels as he stirs, by subtle changes in colour and texture, exactly when it's ready for the oven. This isn't just cooking, it's a kind of sensory science that can't be learned from books. But what really sets Klaus's Zuckerbrot apart is his use of spices. Not just the traditional cinnamon and cloves that German bakers have been using for decades, but new exotic seasonings that are just beginning to arrive in European markets. Cardamom from India, star anise from China, even tiny amounts of vanilla from the New World that cost more per ounce than silver. These spices transform his Zuckerbrot from simple sweet bread into something approaching modern cake. The flavors are complex, layered, sophisticated in ways that would have been impossible just a generation earlier. Each bite reveals new tastes, new combinations, new possibilities that hint at the culinary revolution that's beginning to transform European food culture. A group of wealthy merchants approaches Klaus's stall, drawn by the incredible aromas emanating from his new oven. These are men who have traveled extensively, who have tasted the sophisticated confections of Constantinople and Baghdad, who aren't easily impressed by provincial German baking. But when they taste Klaus's Zuckerbrot, their reactions are immediate and enthusiastic. "This is extraordinary," says Heinrich, a spice trader who's spent years traveling between Nuremberg and Venice. "The texture is unlike anything I've encountered in German baking, and these spice combinations are brilliant." Klaus nods proudly, but he's also thinking strategically. These merchants represent potential customers for large orders, special occasions, perhaps even export opportunities to other cities where German baking isn't well known. The refined sugar and exotic spices that make his confections special are expensive, but they also create opportunities for premium pricing that can justify the investment. "I could prepare custom orders," Klaus suggests, "for special events or wealthy households. The ingredients are costly, but the results speak for themselves." Vai. This conversation represents something historically significant. We're witnessing the moment when medieval artisan production begins to transform into something approaching modern commercial food manufacturing. Klaus isn't just a local baker serving his immediate community. He's an entrepreneur with global supply chains, sophisticated products, and ambitious expansion plans. But Klaus's innovations aren't happening in isolation. Throughout late medieval Europe, similar transformations are taking place as new ingredients, technologies, and trade connections create opportunities for food producers who are willing to experiment and invest. In nearby Frankfurt, a confectioner named Anna Weber has begun using refined sugar to create what she calls marzipan, an almond-based confection that's more sophisticated than anything previously available in German markets. Her techniques are borrowed from Islamic confectioners she met through trade connections, but she's adapted them for local ingredients and tastes. Anna's marzipan isn't just sweet almond paste. It's a sculptural medium that she shapes into elaborate forms, miniature fruits, detailed flowers, even tiny replicas of famous buildings. These aren't just confections. They're edible art pieces that blur the line between food and decoration in ways that anticipate modern cake decorating techniques. The process Anna uses to create her marzipan sculptures requires skills that combine cooking, artistry, and engineering. The almond paste must be prepared to exactly the right consistency, firm enough to hold detailed shapes, but soft enough to work with. The coloring agents she uses are derived from natural sources, each one requiring different preparation methods and application techniques. But perhaps most remarkably, Anna has figured out how to preserve her marzipan sculptures for extended periods without spoilage. By controlling moisture content and using natural preservatives derived from various plants, she can create confections that last for weeks or even months while maintaining their appearance and flavor. This preservation technology opens up entirely new possibilities for the confectionery business. Anna can now take custom orders for events scheduled weeks in advance, ship her products to distant cities, and build inventory during slow periods for sale during busy seasons. She's not just a craftsperson anymore. She's running a sophisticated business operation. A noble family from a nearby castle approaches Anna's workshop with an ambitious request. Their daughter is getting married in 3 months, and they want centerpieces for the wedding feast that will be both beautiful and memorable. They've heard about Anna's sculptural abilities and want to commission something unprecedented. "We'd like a miniature replica of our castle," explains the family's steward, a man accustomed to organizing elaborate events. "Something detailed enough that guests will recognize it immediately, but edible so it can be consumed during the celebration." Anna considers the request carefully. Creating a detailed architectural replica in marzipan would require months of work, expensive materials, and techniques she's never attempted before. But it would also be a masterpiece that could establish her reputation throughout the region and attract similar commissions from other wealthy families. It can be done, she says finally, but it will require time, the finest ingredients, and a price that reflects the complexity of the work involved. The negotiation that follows illustrates how late medieval food culture is becoming increasingly sophisticated and commercialized. This isn't just a transaction between a craftsperson and customer. It's a business deal involving custom manufacturing, premium materials, artistic design, and careful project management. But Anna's marzipan castle also represents something deeper about the evolution of medieval food culture. We're witnessing the moment when food stops being purely functional and becomes a form of artistic expression that serves social and cultural functions beyond simple nutrition. As we continue exploring this late medieval German market, we encounter vendors whose innovations hint at the culinary revolution that's beginning to transform European food culture. There's Johann, who has learned to create what he calls gebacken's Eis, literally baked ice, an early form of ice cream that uses techniques borrowed from both Middle Eastern and Chinese traditions. Johann's process involves creating a custard base using eggs, cream, and refined sugar, then freezing it using a combination of natural ice and salt that creates temperatures cold enough to solidify the mixture. But unlike the simple frozen desserts we encountered in Baghdad and Hangzhou, Johann's creation is churned during the freezing process to create a smooth, creamy texture that's completely unlike anything previously available in European markets. The churning process is labor-intensive and requires precise timing, but the results are revolutionary. Johann's gebacken's Eis has a texture that's simultaneously solid and creamy, cold and rich, providing sensory experiences that seem to defy the natural order of things. But Johann has gone beyond simply copying techniques from other cultures. He's adapted his ice cream for German tastes and ingredients, creating flavors that reflect local preferences and seasonal availability. His honey cinnamon variety uses local wildflower honey and spices imported through established trade routes. His apple spice version incorporates fruit from regional orchards and seasoning combinations that German palates find familiar and appealing. A group of university students from the nearby academy approaches Johann's stall, drawn by curiosity about this impossible treat. These are young men who will become the scholars, merchants, and leaders of the next generation, and their willingness to try new foods reflects the changing attitudes that are beginning to transform European culture. How is it possible to create something frozen in this weather? Asks Wilhelm, a theology student whose studies have made him skeptical of anything that seems to violate natural law. Johann grins, enjoying the opportunity to demonstrate his mastery of what seems like magical techniques. It's all about understanding how cold works, he explains, showing them his ice-salt mixture and explaining the principles behind temperature control. The same knowledge that preserves meat through winter can be used to create treats that provide relief from summer heat. The students are fascinated not just by the novelty of frozen dessert, but by the scientific principles involved. They're living at the beginning of the Renaissance, when European culture is becoming increasingly interested in understanding and manipulating natural phenomena. Johann's ice cream represents exactly the kind of technological innovation that characterizes this new age. But as remarkable as these individual innovations are, they're part of a larger transformation that's beginning to reshape European food culture. The late medieval period is witnessing the convergence of several historical trends that will fundamentally change how people think about food, eating, and culinary pleasure. First, there's the expansion of trade routes that's making exotic ingredients available to European markets for the first time. The refined sugar that Klaus uses in his Zuckerbrot, the spices that Anna incorporates into her marzipan, the preservation techniques that Johann applies to his ice cream. All of these represent knowledge and materials that have travelled thousands of miles to reach German markets. Second, there's the development of new technologies that allow food producers to work with unprecedented precision and consistency. Klaus's temperature-controlled oven, Anna's preservation methods, Johann's freezing techniques, all represent advances that make possible entirely new categories of food products. Third, there's the emergence of wealthy urban populations with sophisticated palates and disposable income to spend on luxury foods. The merchants, nobles, and university students we've encountered represent a growing market for premium food products that goes far beyond basic subsistence needs. But perhaps most importantly, there's a changing cultural attitude toward pleasure, indulgence, and the role of food in society. The late medieval period is witnessing the beginning of a shift away from the austere, survival-focused approach to eating that characterized earlier centuries towards something that values culinary artistry, sensory pleasure, and food as a form of cultural expression. This cultural transformation is creating opportunities for food producers who are willing to experiment, invest, and take risks. The vendors we've encountered in Nuremberg represent the cutting edge of this movement. Entrepreneurs who are creating entirely new categories of food products by combining traditional techniques with innovative ingredients and technologies. But they're also creating new social and economic relationships around food. The elaborate negotiations between Anna and her noble customers, the scientific discussions between Johann and his student customers, the premium pricing strategies that Klaus uses for his refined confections. All of this represents a commercialization and sophistication of food culture that anticipates modern restaurant and specialty food industries. As our day in late medieval Nuremberg draws to a close, we can see that we've witnessed something historically significant. We're not just observing the end of medieval food culture, we're seeing the beginning of the culinary traditions that will eventually evolve into our modern food system. The innovations we've encountered, the business models we've observed, the cultural attitudes we've witnessed, all represent the foundation for developments that will transform food culture over the following centuries. The refined sugar techniques will evolve into modern confectionery industries. The artistic food presentation will develop into elaborate restaurant cuisines. The premium pricing strategies will become the luxury food markets we know today. But even as we recognize these connections to the future, it's important to remember that the medieval people we've encountered throughout our journey weren't primitives waiting for modernity to rescue them. They were sophisticated, innovative, creative individuals who were solving complex problems and creating remarkable experiences within the constraints and opportunities of their time. The London cookshop owners, who served questionable but essential meals to working-class customers, were providing crucial services that kept urban populations fed and employed. The Baghdad confectioners who created jewel-like sweets were preserving and advancing culinary traditions that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge. The Chinese street vendors, who combined technical excellence with health consciousness, were participating in food cultures that achieved levels of sophistication that wouldn't be matched in Europe for several more centuries. Each of these food cultures developed its own solutions to the universal human desire for convenient, flavorful, occasionally indulgent eating. Each created its own balance between tradition and innovation, individual artistry and social accessibility, practical necessity, and pure pleasure. And each contributed to the global exchange of culinary knowledge that was gradually creating the interconnected, diverse, constantly evolving food culture that we've inherited today. The spice routes that brought cardamom to Klaus's bakery, the trade networks that carried ice-making techniques from China to Germany, the cultural exchanges that allowed Anna to learn marzipan making from Islamic confectioners, all represent the foundation of our modern global food system. But perhaps most importantly, our journey through medieval junk food has revealed that the fundamental human motivations behind food culture haven't changed at all. The dock worker who grabbed a quick meat pie before his shift in medieval London has the same needs and desires as the office worker who stops at a food truck for lunch today. The merchant's wife, who sought exotic flavors to impress her friends in 13th century Baghdad, shares the same social motivations as the modern food enthusiast posting Instagram photos of artisanal desserts. The university students who were fascinated by Johann's impossible ice cream in 15th century Nuremberg display the same curiosity and willingness to try new experiences that characterizes modern food culture. The children, who dreamed of sweets they couldn't afford in medieval markets, experience the same longing and anticipation that drives modern candy store visits. What's changed isn't human nature, but the scale, technology, and global reach of our food systems. We have access to ingredients from every corner of the world, cooking techniques that can control temperature and timing with scientific precision, and distribution networks that can deliver fresh food across continents in a matter of hours. But we're still motivated by the same basic desires that drove medieval food culture: the need for convenient nutrition, the craving for familiar comfort foods, the desire for occasional indulgence, the social functions of shared eating experiences, and the simple pleasure of discovering new flavors and textures. The medieval fritter seller, who carefully balanced sweet and savory flavors to please her customers, was solving exactly the same problems that modern snack food manufacturers address with focus groups and market research. The difference is scale and methodology, not fundamental purpose. The medieval confectioner, who used expensive imported spices to create luxury treats, was serving exactly the same market segment that modern artisanal food producers target with premium ingredients and specialized techniques. The business model hasn't changed, just the specific ingredients and marketing methods. The medieval street vendors who created portable, shelf-stable foods for travelers and workers were addressing exactly the same needs that modern convenience food industries serve with processed snacks and ready-made meals. The fundamental challenge of providing convenient nutrition remains identical. Even the health concerns that worried medieval customers about cookshop food safety have direct parallels in modern anxieties about processed foods, artificial ingredients, and industrial food production methods. The desire for food that's both convenient and healthy represents a continuous thread connecting medieval and modern food culture. Understanding this continuity helps us appreciate both the remarkable achievements of medieval food culture and the ongoing challenges facing modern food systems. The medieval vendors we've encountered were remarkably innovative and sophisticated within their constraints, creating experiences and solving problems in ways that often rival modern approaches. Their deep understanding of seasonal ingredients, their integration of culinary and health knowledge, their emphasis on personal relationships between producers and consumers, their celebration of food as cultural expression, all represent values and approaches that many modern food enthusiasts are trying to recover and reintegrate into contemporary eating practices. The farm-to-table movement, with its emphasis on local ingredients and personal relationships with producers, echoes the medieval preference for knowing where your food comes from and who made it. The artisanal food movement, with its focus on traditional techniques and premium ingredients, reflects the same values that drove medieval luxury confectioners to create unique, high-quality products. The growing interest in food as cultural expression, from elaborate restaurant presentations to social media food photography, continues the same tradition of using food to communicate identity, status, and aesthetic values that characterized medieval feast culture. Even the modern fascination with exotic ingredients and fusion cuisines represents a continuation of the same curiosity and experimentation that led medieval merchants to seek out new spices and techniques from distant cultures. But our journey through medieval junk food also reveals some things that we've lost in the transition to modern food systems. The personal relationships between food producers and consumers that characterize medieval markets created accountability and trust that's often missing from industrial food production. The seasonal rhythms that shaped medieval eating patterns created anticipation and variety that's been diminished by year-round availability of all ingredients. The integration of food with cultural and religious observances gave eating a depth of meaning that's often absent from modern food experiences. The emphasis on craftsmanship and individual artistry that characterized medieval food production created a level of personal investment and pride that's difficult to maintain in mass production systems. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval understanding of food as simultaneously practical and pleasurable, necessary and celebratory, individual and communal, represents a balanced approach to eating that modern food culture sometimes struggles to achieve. As we conclude our exploration of medieval junk food, it's worth reflecting on what this history teaches us about human nature, cultural development, and the possibilities for future food culture. The medieval people we've encountered weren't living in a primitive, backward age, waiting for progress to rescue them. They were creating sophisticated, innovative, culturally rich food experiences that served multiple functions simultaneously and often achieved levels of quality and satisfaction that modern food systems struggle to match. Their solutions to the challenges of feeding large populations, creating convenient portable foods, balancing nutrition with pleasure, and integrating food with cultural expression represent accumulated wisdom that remains relevant today. Their emphasis on craftsmanship, personal relationships, and cultural meaning in food production offers models that modern food systems could benefit from adopting. But they also face constraints and limitations that modern technology has largely overcome. The seasonal availability that created anticipation also created scarcity and malnutrition. The personal relationships that ensured quality also limited scale and accessibility. The artisanal production that created unique experiences also made food expensive and inconsistent. The challenge for modern food culture is to capture the best aspects of medieval food traditions while maintaining the scale, consistency, and accessibility that modern populations require. This means finding ways to preserve craftsmanship within industrial systems, maintain personal relationships within global networks, and integrate cultural meaning within commercial structures. Some modern food movements are beginning to address these challenges successfully. Farmers' markets that connect consumers directly with producers echo medieval market relationships. Artisanal food producers who use traditional techniques with modern quality control combine the best of both approaches. Restaurants that emphasize seasonal ingredients and cultural storytelling integrate medieval values with contemporary presentation. But there's still much work to be done to create food systems that serve human needs as completely and satisfyingly as the best examples of medieval food culture managed to achieve. The medieval vendors we've encountered offer inspiration and guidance for this ongoing effort, demonstrating that it's possible to create food experiences that are simultaneously practical and magical, accessible and sophisticated, traditional and innovative. Their legacy lives on every time we bite into a perfectly crafted pastry, discover a new flavor combination, share a special meal with friends, or find comfort in familiar foods during difficult times. They remind us that food is never just about nutrition, but always about the deeper human needs for pleasure, connection, meaning, and the simple joy of being alive in a world full of delicious possibilities. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson we can learn from our journey through medieval junk food, that the desire to make life a little sweeter, a little more flavorful, a little more satisfying, represents one of the most enduring and universal aspects of human nature. Whether we're talking about a 13th century apple fritter, or a modern artisanal donut, a medieval meat pie, or a contemporary food truck taco, a Byzantine honey cake, or a modern birthday cake, we're all participating in the same ancient human tradition of using food to transform ordinary moments into something special. The tools change, the ingredients evolve, the scale expands, but the fundamental human motivation remains exactly the same. We eat not just to survive, but to celebrate, to connect, to explore, to comfort ourselves, and to add a little sweetness to the sometimes bitter experience of being human. And in that sense, we're no different from the medieval people whose food adventures we've been sharing. They would recognize our cravings, understand our pleasures, and probably laugh at our pretensions while secretly envying our access to chocolate. We're all part of the same ongoing story, the same endless human quest to answer the eternal question, what's for dessert? And thank goodness for that. Because a world without that question, without the endless creativity and ingenuity it inspires, would be a much less delicious place to live. So the next time you grab a quick snack, try something new, or share a special treat with someone you care about, take a moment to appreciate the thousands of years of human creativity, experimentation, and sheer stubborn determination to make food better that made that moment possible. You're not just eating, you're participating in one of humanity's oldest and most important cultural traditions. You're carrying forward a legacy that stretches back through countless generations of people who shared your appetite for something a little bit special, and that's a pretty remarkable thing to chew on.